The scariest thing about a cold case isn't the crime itself. It's the fact that the perpetrator is still out there, living a normal life. Someone you pass on the street might be the monster we are looking for. They have no conscience, no remorse, and most importantly, no handcuffs on their wrists. Today, we pull back the curtain on the one case that refuses to stay dead. This is a story of a hidden predator and the truth that is waiting to be found. May 14, 2008. At approximately 2 a.m., 19-year-old Brandon Swanson called his parents from a rural gravel road in southwestern Minnesota. He told them his Chevrolet Lumina had slid into a ditch and he needed a ride home. What should have been a routine late-night pickup became one of the most unsettling missing person cases in modern American history. For the next 47 minutes, Brandon remained on the phone with his father, Brian Swanson, describing his surroundings as he walked through dark farmland. Then, shortly after 2:30 a.m., he suddenly said, "Oh shit!" The line stayed connected, but Brandon never spoke again. More than a decade later, no confirmed trace of him has ever been found. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30, 1989, and grew up in Marshall, Minnesota. In 2008, he was attending Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby, studying wind energy technology. On May 13, 2008, after completing spring semester classes, he spent the evening celebrating with friends. Witnesses later told investigators he attended gatherings in Canby and Lind before beginning the drive home shortly before midnight. According to those who saw him that night, Brandon appeared normal, and there was no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. Around 1:54 a.m., Brandon phoned his parents and explained that he had accidentally driven into a ditch. He believed he was near Lind, a small town southwest of Marshall. His parents immediately got into their vehicle and drove toward the location he described. During the call, Brandon remained calm. He was not injured and expected to be home soon. Yet almost immediately, strange inconsistencies began appearing. Brandon told his parents he could see lights from nearby buildings and roads. His parents reached the area he described and repeatedly flashed their headlights, expecting Brandon to do the same. Neither side could see the other. For nearly an hour, Brian and Annette Swanson drove rural roads while maintaining phone contact with their son. Brandon insisted he knew where he was. His parents insisted they were exactly where he said he should be. The two parties were somehow separated despite believing they were only a short distance apart. Eventually, Brandon became frustrated and decided to leave his vehicle behind. In the distance, he could see lights which he believed belonged to Lind. He told his father he would walk toward town while remaining on the phone. As Brandon crossed fields and climbed over fences, he continued describing what he encountered. At one point, he mentioned hearing running water. The conversation remained normal. Then, without warning, Brian heard his son exclaim, "Oh shit." Silence followed. Brian repeatedly called out Brandon's name but received no response. The phone connection remained open briefly before disconnecting. Every attempt to call back went straight to voicemail or received no answer. Those 3 words became the last confirmed communication from Brandon Swanson. The search began almost immediately. Family members, local law enforcement, volunteers, and eventually state authorities focused on the area near Lind because that was where Brandon believed he was located. Yet hours of searching produced nothing. Then investigators obtained cell phone records and discovered the first major mystery in the case. Brandon had not been near Lind at all. Data from cell phone towers placed him near the communities of Taunton and Porter in Lincoln County, roughly 25 miles from the area where he thought he was stranded. Investigators eventually located Brandon's Chevrolet Lumina in a ditch along a remote gravel road. The vehicle showed no signs of a collision serious enough to injure him. There was no evidence of a struggle. Nothing suggested another vehicle had been involved. The discovery raised a troubling question. How could Brandon have been so completely mistaken about his location? Investigators later proposed that distant lights may have confused him. In the darkness of rural Minnesota, a grain elevator light or other elevated structure could have appeared similar to a landmark near Lind. If that theory is correct, Brandon spent nearly an hour guiding his parents toward a location that was nowhere near where he actually stood. What began as a simple roadside recovery had become a search across miles of farmland, drainage ditches, creeks, and abandoned properties. Once Brandon's true location was identified, authorities launched an extensive search effort. Deputies from multiple agencies participated. Search dogs were deployed, Helicopters examined the terrain from above. Volunteers searched fields on foot. One tracking dog followed Brandon's scent for approximately 3 miles from the abandoned vehicle. The trail crossed farmland, past abandoned structures, and eventually reached the Yellow Medicine River. The river immediately became the focus of attention. Brandon had mentioned hearing water during his phone call. The timing also seemed suspicious. If he had been walking through darkness and suddenly encountered the riverbank, his final words would make sense. Many investigators believed he may have accidentally fallen into the water after uttering his last sentence. Yet the evidence never fully supported that explanation. Search teams repeatedly examined the river. Divers and specially trained dogs were brought in. No body was recovered. More importantly, reports indicated that the tracking dog did not stop at the river. The scent trail appeared to continue beyond the opposite bank before eventually disappearing. If Brandon drowned in the river, why would the scent continue farther along the route? The apparent contradiction became one of the most debated aspects of the case. As months turned into years, the disappearance became even more perplexing. Large portions of the surrounding countryside were searched repeatedly. Fields were revisited after crops were harvested. Areas inaccessible during one season were examined during another. Search efforts eventually covered more than 100 square miles. Despite the scale of the operation, investigators failed to locate any confirmed evidence connected to Brandon after the phone call ended. No cell phone was found. No wallet was recovered. No clothing was discovered. No human remains were identified. The complete absence of physical evidence transformed what initially appeared to be a likely accident into a much deeper mystery. In many missing person investigations, even when a victim is not immediately located, some trace eventually emerges. In Brandon's case, nothing did. Several theories have been proposed over the years. The most widely accepted remains accidental death. Brandon may have fallen into the river, become trapped in a concealed drainage system, or suffered a fatal injury in an isolated area that searchers somehow missed. Rural farmland contains numerous hazards, including culverts, wells, dense vegetation, and abandoned structures capable of concealing evidence for long periods. Another theory suggests that Brandon encountered another person after the phone call ended. Law enforcement has never publicly identified evidence supporting foul play, but investigators have also never completely ruled it out. The lack of witnesses, suspects, forensic evidence, or suspicious activity makes the theory difficult to evaluate. It remains possible but unproven. A separate mystery concerns Brandon's state of mind. Some observers argue that his inability to correctly identify his location suggests significant disorientation. Others point out that he successfully maintained a coherent 47-minute conversation, provided detailed descriptions of his surroundings, and never appeared confused to his father. The contradiction creates another unanswered question. Was Brandon thinking clearly and simply mistaken about where he was, or was he far more disoriented than anyone realized? The case ultimately produced consequences far beyond the search itself. Brandon's parents later criticized the initial response they received when reporting their adult son missing. They argued that authorities treated the situation as less urgent because Brandon was 19 years old. Working with Minnesota lawmakers, the Swanson family helped create legislation known as Brandon's Law. Signed in 2009 by Governor Tim Pawlenty, the law requires law enforcement agencies to take reports of missing adults under dangerous circumstances more seriously and begin investigations more quickly. February 9, 2004, a cold winter evening settles over Route 112 in the small town of Haverhill, New Hampshire. At approximately 7:27 p.m., local resident Faith Westman looks out from her house and notices a black 1996 Saturn sedan resting against a snowbank after what appears to be a single-vehicle crash. Inside the car is a young woman later identified as 21-year-old University of Massachusetts nursing student Maura Murray. Nothing about the scene initially suggests that it will become one of the most debated missing person cases in American history. Yet within minutes, Maura Murray will seemingly vanish without a trace, leaving behind a mystery that investigators, journalists, private detectives, and thousands of online researchers have spent more than 2 decades trying to solve. To understand the disappearance, investigators first examined the days leading up to February 9. Maura Kathleen Murray was born on May 4, 1982 in Hanson, Massachusetts. In 2004, she was enrolled in the nursing program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Several unusual events occurred shortly before her disappearance. On February 5, 2004, while working a security shift on campus, Maura reportedly became upset after receiving a phone call. According to university supervisor Karen Saulnier, Maura appeared emotionally distressed and was described as being in a near catatonic state. When asked what was wrong, she allegedly replied, "My sister." Investigators later learned that Maura's sister Kathleen had been struggling with personal issues, though no evidence has ever shown that the phone call itself directly triggered Maura's disappearance. Another strange incident occurred on February 7. While driving a car belonging to her father, Fred Murray, Maura crashed into a guardrail near Hadley, Massachusetts shortly after leaving a party. Police responded, but no criminal charges were filed. The accident raised questions because it occurred only 2 days before her disappearance. Fred later stated that the incident was unrelated and that he believed his daughter was simply under stress. On the morning of February 9th, Maura's behavior became even more puzzling. Records show that she searched online for directions, lodging information, and vacation accommodations in northern New Hampshire and Vermont. At approximately 1 p.m., she emailed professors and supervisors, claiming there had been a death in her family and that she would be away from campus for about a week. Investigators later confirmed that no family member had died. Around 3:15 p.m., surveillance footage captured Maura withdrawing approximately $280 from an ATM in Amherst, nearly all the money available in her bank account. Shortly afterward, she purchased alcohol from a nearby liquor store. The receipt and security footage would later become important pieces of evidence because they documented her final confirmed activities before leaving Massachusetts. Sometime after 4 p.m., Maura departed Amherst alone in her Saturn. What happened during the next 3 hours remains partially unknown. Cell phone records place her traveling north toward New Hampshire. The route she selected led into a rural region known for winding roads, forests, and limited cell phone coverage. Investigators have never determined exactly why she chose that destination. No confirmed reservation existed in her name. No note explained her plans. No friend or family member knew precisely where she intended to go. At approximately 7:27 p.m., her journey came to an abrupt halt. Witness Faith Westman observed the crashed Saturn outside her home on Route 112. According to her statements, she saw a young woman moving around the vehicle but did not appear seriously injured. Around the same time, a passing school bus driver named Butch Atwood stopped to assist. Atwood later told investigators that he spoke directly with Maura. He offered to call emergency services, but she declined, claiming that she had already contacted roadside assistance. This statement immediately stood out because cell phone service in the area was unreliable and investigators found no evidence that such a call had been made. Atwood then drove home and contacted authorities himself. The timeline that followed would become the central mystery of the case. Dispatch records indicate that police were notified shortly after Atwood's call. Officer Cecil Smith arrived at the crash scene at approximately 7:46 p.m. When he reached the location, Maura Murray was gone. Her Saturn remained behind. Inside the vehicle, investigators discovered personal belongings, school materials, alcohol containers, and evidence suggesting that wine may have spilled inside the car. However, there was no sign of the driver. No witnesses reported seeing her walk away. No footprints clearly led into the surrounding woods despite fresh snow conditions. The disappearance appears to have occurred within a window of roughly 10 to 15 minutes. The absence of physical evidence quickly generated competing theories. One possibility was that Maura fled the scene to avoid police contact. Because alcohol was present in the vehicle, and because she had previously been involved in another accident only 2 days earlier, some investigators believed she may have panicked and left on foot. New Hampshire authorities organized extensive searches in the days and weeks that followed. Search teams, helicopters, tracking dogs, and ground personnel examined the surrounding forests, yet they found no confirmed trace of her. Search experts later noted that snow conditions should have revealed a trail if she had wandered deep into the woods immediately after the crash. The lack of such evidence became one of the strongest arguments against the simple exposure hypothesis. Another mystery emerged through the use of scent tracking dogs. On February 11, 2 days after the disappearance, A search dog reportedly followed Mora's scent eastward along Route 112 for approximately 100 yards before abruptly losing the trail near the roadway. Some investigators interpreted this result as evidence that Mora entered another vehicle. If true, it would mean that someone encountered her shortly after the crash and transported her away from the scene. Yet no verified witness ever reported picking her up. No driver came forward, no vehicle was conclusively linked to her disappearance. As the years passed, attention shifted toward the possibility of foul play. Several local individuals were examined by investigators and independent researchers. Various theories emerged involving opportunistic predators, accidental death concealed by another person, or even an encounter with someone she trusted. However, no suspect has ever been charged. No forensic evidence has connected any known individual to Mora's disappearance. Each theory ultimately encounters the same obstacle: the complete lack of definitive physical proof. Adding to the mystery are the circumstances surrounding Mora's preparations before leaving Amherst. Why did she falsely tell professors there had been a death in the family? Why withdraw nearly all available cash? Why pack belongings and search for accommodations? Why travel alone without informing friends or relatives of her destination? These actions suggest planning, yet they do not clearly indicate whether she intended a temporary retreat, an attempt to escape stress, or something else entirely. Investigators have never found a diary entry, letter, or digital record that fully explains her intentions. The case gained renewed attention through documentaries, podcasts, television programs, and online communities. Thousands of amateur investigators have analyzed maps, witness statements, police reports, and timelines. Some believe Mora died accidentally in the wilderness and remains undiscovered despite searches. Others argue that the scent trail and missing footprints point toward a vehicle pickup. Still others suspect an unknown criminal encountered her during the narrow window between the crash and police arrival. Each theory explains some facts while leaving others unresolved. More than 22 years later, the central questions remain unchanged. Why was Mora Murray traveling through rural New Hampshire on February 9, 2004? What happened during the brief interval after the crash? Did she voluntarily leave the scene, accept a ride from a stranger, become the victim of a crime, or perish somewhere that search teams failed to examine? Every confirmed fact in the timeline has been scrutinized repeatedly, yet the crucial missing piece has never been found. February 14, 2000, Shelby, North Carolina. Around 2:30 a.m., Harold Degree checked on his two children before going to bed. Both appeared to be asleep. A few hours later, 9-year-old Asha Degree had vanished. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, and no indication that anyone had entered the family's home. Yet within hours, multiple independent witnesses would report seeing a young girl matching Asha's description walking alone along Highway 18 during a cold, rainy pre-dawn morning. More than 25 years later, investigators still cannot explain why she left where she intended to go or what happened after she disappeared. Asha lived with her parents, Harold and Aquila Degree, and her older brother O'Brien in Shelby, a small city west of Charlotte. Family members, teachers, and friends consistently described her as responsible, quiet, and well-behaved. She had no history of running away and no known problems at home. That immediately created the first mystery. Why would a 9-year-old child leave a safe home alone in the middle of the night? The timeline only deepened the puzzle. On the evening of February 13, the family followed a normal routine. A nearby car accident caused a temporary power outage, but electricity returned around 12:30 a.m. Harold later stated that he checked on his children after the power came back and again around 2:30 a.m. Both appeared to be asleep. Sometime after that, investigators believe Asha quietly got out of bed, took a backpack she had apparently packed beforehand, and left the house on foot. Between approximately 3:45 a.m. and 4:15 a.m., several motorists reported seeing a young girl walking south along Highway 18 about a mile from the Degree home. One truck driver became concerned enough to turn around and check on her. According to investigators, the girl ran from the roadside into nearby woods when approached. These sightings are considered the last confirmed observations of Asha. They also created another mystery. If she needed help, why run away from an adult? And if she was afraid, why leave home at all? As daylight arrived, local, state, and federal authorities launched a massive search. Hundreds of leads were examined, but little evidence was found. Then investigators discovered personal items believed to belong to Asha near a storage shed close to the area where she was last seen. Among them were a hair bow and a pencil. The discovery strongly suggested she had reached the area, but it raised new questions. Was she hiding there, waiting for someone? Or had someone brought her there? Another puzzling clue emerged from the same location, a photograph of an unidentified young girl. Asha's family did not recognize her, and investigators were never able to establish a clear connection between the photograph and the disappearance. The image became one of the strangest loose ends in the entire case. Investigators soon learned that Asha's backpack contained clothing and personal items, suggesting that her departure may have been planned rather than impulsive. That detail fueled theories that she expected to meet someone or had been persuaded to leave. However, no evidence has ever conclusively explained what motivated her. Then, on August 3, 2001, nearly 18 months after Asha vanished, construction workers made a shocking discovery near Morganton, about 26 miles north of Shelby. Buried beside Highway 18 was Asha's backpack. What made the find so unusual was its condition. The bag had been wrapped inside 2 black plastic trash bags before being concealed in the ground. Someone had clearly handled it after Asha disappeared. The contents of the backpack only deepened the mystery. Investigators later revealed that it contained a copy of Dr. Seuss's McElligot's Pool and a New Kids on the Block t-shirt, neither of which were known to belong to Asha. Authorities released details about both items, hoping someone would recognize them, but no definitive explanation ever emerged. For years, the investigation remained stalled. Then, in 2016, the FBI announced a significant new lead. Investigators were searching for information about a dark green early 1970s Lincoln Continental Mark IV or Ford Thunderbird that may have been connected to Asha's disappearance. Witness information suggested she might have entered such a vehicle. The announcement offered a possible explanation for how she traveled beyond the area where she was last seen, but no publicly identified suspect was charged. The case entered a new phase in September 2024 when investigators executed multiple search warrants linked to the disappearance. Court documents revealed that modern forensic analysis of evidence connected to Asha's backpack had generated new leads. Authorities stated that they believed Asha was the victim of homicide and that her body had likely been concealed. In February 2025, investigators publicly identified suspects and formally classified the case as a homicide investigation. Even so, no body has been recovered, and many details remain unknown. That is what makes the disappearance of Asha Degree so unsettling. Investigators know she left her home. Multiple witnesses saw her walking alone before dawn. Physical evidence places her near the highway and links her to a backpack found miles away. Yet the most important question remains unanswered. Why did a 9-year-old girl voluntarily leave the safety of her home on a stormy February night? More than 2 decades later, that question continues to sit at the center of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. April 1, 2014. At approximately 4:39 p.m., an iPhone 4 belonging to 21-year-old Dutch student Chris Kremers attempted to dial emergency services from somewhere beyond the Continental Divide near the El Pianista Trail outside Boquete, Panama. 12 minutes later, at 4:51 p.m., a Samsung Galaxy S3 belonging to her 22-year-old friend Lisanne Froon made another emergency call attempt. Neither call connected. Those 2 failed calls would become the beginning of one of the most debated disappearance cases of the modern era. Just hours earlier, nothing seemed unusual. Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon had arrived in Panama on March 15, 2014. After spending 2 weeks traveling through the country, they reached the mountain town of Boquete on March 29. Both women came from Amersfoort in the Netherlands. Chris had recently completed studies in cultural social education, while Lisanne had graduated in applied psychology. They planned to learn Spanish, volunteer with local children, and spend several weeks immersed in Panamanian culture. On the morning of April 1, shortly before 11 a.m., they set out on the El Pianista Trail, a well-known hiking route that climbs into the cloud forest surrounding Volcan Baru. They carried a small backpack containing water, phones, a Canon PowerShot SX270 camera, sunglasses, and personal belongings. Weather conditions were considered favorable, and the trail itself was popular among tourists. Nothing suggested that within hours they would disappear. The first clues emerged from the camera recovered months later. investigators discovered a sequence of photographs taken during the hike. The images showed the women smiling, crossing streams, and reaching the mirador, a scenic viewpoint near the top of the trail. Timestamps indicated they reached this location around early afternoon. The most significant detail was that several photographs appeared to show them continuing beyond the mirador, entering a far less traveled section of terrain on the opposite side of the mountain. These images became the last confirmed record of them alive. Then the timeline suddenly changed. At 4:39 p.m., the first emergency call was attempted. What happened between the final daylight photograph and that first distress call remains the central mystery of the entire case. Did they become lost? Did one of them suffer an injury? Did they encounter dangerous terrain, or did something else happen entirely? The phone records reveal only the beginning of a struggle. During the evening of April 1 and the following days, both phones repeatedly attempted to contact emergency services through numbers 112 and 911. Each attempt failed because there was no signal in the remote jungle environment. Investigators later reconstructed a detailed timeline from the devices. The pattern suggested two people desperately searching for a connection while trying to conserve battery power. The phones were not left running continuously. Instead, they were switched on periodically, likely to check for reception before being turned off again. By April 4, Lizanne's Samsung battery was exhausted. It would never be used again. Chris's iPhone continued to be activated over the following days. Then another mystery appeared. Beginning on April 5th, the iPhone was powered on multiple times without the correct PIN code being entered. Records indicate either an incorrect code or no code at all was submitted during these attempts. This detail generated enormous speculation. Chris was known to use her phone regularly and would have known her own PIN. If she was still alive, why was the correct code no longer being entered? If she was not alive, who was turning on the phone? The evidence provides no answer. Investigators could establish only that the phone continued to be activated until April 11, when it was switched on for the final time at 10:51 a.m. and powered off permanently at 11:56 a.m. Yet the most disturbing evidence was still waiting to be discovered. More than a week after the disappearance, during the night of April 8, the Canon camera suddenly became active again. Between approximately 7 p.m. and 10 p.m., around 90 photographs were taken in near total darkness. Most of the images revealed little more than blackness illuminated by flash. Some showed vegetation, others showed rocks. Several appeared to depict a ravine or riverbank. One image captured the back of Chris Kremer's head. Another showed what looked like a branch decorated with red plastic bags. Another appeared to show personal belongings arranged on a rock. The photographs immediately created a new mystery. Why were 90 images taken over several hours? One possibility is practical. Search and rescue specialists have suggested the flash may have been used as a signaling device to attract attention from aircraft or rescuers. Another theory argues the camera was being used as a makeshift light source in complete darkness. Others have proposed that the photographs accidentally captured moments during a fall or while navigating difficult terrain. No explanation fully accounts for every image. The photographs remain among the most analyzed pieces of evidence in any modern missing person investigation. As the mystery deepened, search operations expanded dramatically. Local volunteers, indigenous guides, police units, helicopters, and later Dutch investigators combed large sections of jungle surrounding Boquete. On April 6, the families arrived from the Netherlands and joined a large-scale search effort. Despite extensive operations covering trails, rivers, and forested slopes, no trace of the women was found. Then, after 10 weeks, the case changed again. On June 14, 2014, a woman from the indigenous village of Alto Romero discovered a blue backpack near a riverbank and turned it over to authorities. Inside were Chris and Lizanne's phones, the Canon camera, cash, sunglasses, water bottles, and personal documents. Investigators reported that the contents were largely intact and in surprisingly usable condition. The backpack immediately became one of the most controversial discoveries in the case. How had it arrived there? Had it been carried by floodwaters? Had someone moved it? Or had it remained undiscovered for weeks despite extensive searches? The discovery triggered a new wave of searches along the Culebra River system. Soon, investigators located additional evidence. Chris's shorts were found on a riverbank. Then came the discovery everyone had feared. Human remains began to emerge from the area. A boot containing Lizanne's foot was recovered. Fragments of pelvis and bone were later identified as belonging to Chris. Eventually, at least 33 bone fragments linked to the two women were recovered and subjected to DNA analysis. Yet even after months of searching, only about 10% of Lizanne's remains and roughly 5% of Chris's remains were ever located. The condition of the remains created still more questions. Forensic specialists examined the bones and attempted to determine what had happened. Some experts favored an accident scenario. The terrain beyond the Mirador contained steep slopes, rivers, and numerous locations where a fall could cause serious injury. Dutch forensic investigators later stated that becoming lost and suffering a fatal accident remained the most plausible explanation. Others pointed to unresolved issues. Why were the emergency calls concentrated in specific periods? Why did the phone usage pattern change after April 5? Why were so few remains recovered? Why did the backpack survive while so much else disappeared? And perhaps, most importantly, what exactly happened between the final daytime photograph and the first emergency call only a few hours later? More than a decade later, there is still no universally accepted answer. No conclusive evidence of homicide was ever established. No suspect was charged. No definitive cause of death was determined. The official evidence supports the possibility that two inexperienced hikers became lost in an unforgiving wilderness and eventually succumbed to injury, exposure, or the environment. Yet the unusual phone records, the nighttime photographs, the scattered remains, and the unanswered gaps in the timeline continue to fuel debate among investigators, journalists, and online communities around the world. The disappearance of Chris Kremers and Lizanne Froon remains unsettling for a simple reason. Unlike many cold cases, this one left behind photographs, phone logs, timestamps, GPS clues, recovered belongings, and physical evidence. There is no shortage of data. The mystery exists because every new piece of evidence seems to answer one question while creating another. More than 10 years after two young women walked into the cloud forests above Boquete, the most important part of their story, the events that unfolded after the last photograph and before the first emergency call, remains hidden. Somewhere in the jungle of Panama. March 31, 1922. In the isolated Bavarian countryside near the village of Grobern, roughly 70 kilometers north of Munich, 6 people spent what appeared to be an ordinary evening at a small farm known as Hinterkaifeck. Within hours, every resident of the property would be dead. More than a century later, despite thousands of pages of investigation records, dozens of suspects, and repeated reviews by modern researchers, no one has ever been convicted of the crime. What transformed the case into one of the most disturbing mysteries in criminal history was not only the brutality of the murders, but a series of bizarre events before and after the killings that remain difficult to explain even today. The victims were Andreas Gruber, age 63, his wife Cecilia Gruber, age 72, their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, age 35, Victoria's daughter Cecilia, age 7, her son Josef, age 2, and the family's new maid, Maria Baumgartner, age 44. Maria had arrived at the farm only hours before the murders. Her sister accompanied her to the property and later became one of the last known people to see the family alive. The mystery arguably began before the murders themselves. During the weeks leading up to March 31, Andreas Gruber reportedly told neighbors about several strange incidents. He discovered footprints in fresh snow leading from a nearby forest toward the farm. What made the discovery unsettling was that he could not find any tracks leading back out. Around the same time, he found a newspaper from Munich that no one in the household had purchased. A key to the property disappeared. Most disturbing of all were reports of footsteps coming from the attic. Andreas searched the building but claimed to find nobody. He discussed these events with neighbors yet never contacted police. Years later, investigators would wonder whether these incidents were unrelated coincidences or evidence that someone had already been secretly watching the family. The family's previous maid had left the farm months earlier. According to later statements, she believed the property was haunted after hearing unexplained noises in the attic. While such claims are impossible to verify, they added another layer to the growing legend surrounding Hinterkaifeck. What is certain is that multiple witnesses later confirmed hearing about the strange events before the murders became public knowledge. The next mystery concerns the murders themselves. Investigators concluded that sometime during the evening of March 31, 4 members of the family were lured into the barn one after another. Andreas Gruber, Cecilia Gruber, Victoria Gabriel, and 7-year-old Kazelia were all killed there with blows to the head from a mattock, a farm tool similar to a pickaxe. The sequence remains unknown, but evidence suggested they did not enter the barn together. Instead, they appear to have arrived individually or in small succession. This immediately raised a question that investigators never answered. Why would each person continue entering an area where previous family members had already disappeared? Some detectives believed the killer was someone the family knew and trusted. Others suggested a noise from the livestock may have drawn them one by one. No theory explains every detail. After the 4 victims were killed in the barn, the murderer entered the house. There, 2-year-old Josef was killed in his bassinet and Maria Baumgartner was murdered in her bedroom. The same weapon was used throughout the attack. Autopsies performed on April 5, 1922, by court physician Johann Baptist Aumüller determined that blunt force trauma caused the deaths. Investigators later recovered the murder weapon hidden on the property. One of the most haunting discoveries emerged during the autopsies. Medical evidence indicated that young Kazelia may have survived for several hours after receiving her injuries. Investigators found clumps of her hair in the straw where she lay. The conclusion was that she had repeatedly pulled out her own hair while suffering and waiting for help that never came. More than 100 years later, this remains among the most chilling details ever recorded in a European murder investigation. Yet the murders were only the beginning of the mystery. The behavior of the killer afterward created questions that remain unanswered. Evidence suggested that someone stayed on the farm for several days after the murders. Livestock were fed. Food from the kitchen was consumed. Smoke was seen coming from the chimney. Witnesses passing near the property reported signs of activity. If those observations were accurate, the killer may have spent as many as 3 days living among the bodies of 6 victims. Few murder cases in history contain such a disturbing possibility. Investigators never determined whether the individual remained to hide evidence, search for money, or simply because the farm provided shelter. The bodies were not discovered immediately. On April 1, traveling coffee merchants visited the farm but received no response. Several days later, 7-year-old Kazelia's unexplained absence from school attracted attention. The family also failed to attend church services. On April 4th, mechanic Albert Hoffner arrived to repair a farm engine. Despite finding no members of the household, he completed his work and left. Later that afternoon, neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer, accompanied by Michael Pohl and Jakob Sigel, entered the property and discovered the bodies. By then, 4 days had passed since the murders. Unfortunately, the crime scene was heavily contaminated. Curious villagers walked through the property. Some moved objects, others touched evidence. People entered and exited freely before forensic procedures could be established. Considering that modern crime scene preservation techniques did not yet exist, investigators lost valuable opportunities to identify the killer. Inspector Georg Reingruber led the official investigation from Munich, but many clues had already been compromised before his team arrived. As detectives examined possible motives, another mystery emerged from the family's private life. Andreas Gruber and Victoria Gabriel had previously faced allegations of incest. Court records from the years before the murders confirmed that authorities investigated the accusations. The scandal created tension within the local community and fueled countless theories. Some investigators believed family secrets may have provided a motive for murder. Others argued that the rumors distracted attention from more likely suspects. To this day, no direct evidence links the allegations to the crime itself, but they remain one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Several suspects emerged over the decades. One of the most frequently discussed was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor who had a complicated relationship with Victoria and may have been connected to questions surrounding young Josef's paternity. Others included traveling laborers, former farm workers, local criminals, and even members of paramilitary organizations active in post-World War I Germany. Investigators examined numerous leads, yet every suspect ultimately lacked sufficient evidence. No arrest ever resulted in a conviction. The mystery deepened further when later witnesses reported unusual encounters. One farmer claimed he saw 2 unidentified figures near the forest close to Hinterkaifeck on the night of the murders. Another traveler reported being approached by a person carrying a lantern near the property after the killings. In 1927, a stranger allegedly told a local resident that he was the murderer before disappearing into the forest. None of these reports could be verified, but they became part of the expanding mythology surrounding the case. The 29th of November 1970, on a cold afternoon in Isdalen Valley, a remote and rugged area outside the city of Bergen, Norway, a man walking with his 2 daughters made a discovery that would trigger one of Europe's most enduring mysteries. Lying among rocks on a hillside was the burned body of an unidentified woman. The scene immediately struck investigators as unusual. The body had been severely burned, yet several objects remained nearby, including a partially melted umbrella, a watch, rubber boots, and fragments of personal belongings. Officers from the Bergen Police Department arrived quickly and launched what initially appeared to be a routine investigation into an unexplained death. Within days, however, the case would evolve into something far stranger. The autopsy conducted shortly afterward revealed a series of disturbing details. Pathologists determined that the woman had died from a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and an overdose of sleeping pills. Toxicological analysis identified significant quantities of barbiturates in her system. Investigators also noted bruising around her neck, raising questions about whether another person had been involved in her death. Although the official conclusion eventually leaned towards suicide, the physical evidence failed to eliminate the possibility of homicide. The burned condition of the body complicated many forensic examinations, leaving crucial questions unanswered from the very beginning. The first major breakthrough came when police traced luggage connected to the victim. At Bergen railway station, investigators discovered 2 suitcases that appeared to belong to the dead woman. Their contents transformed the case completely. Inside were wigs, multiple pairs of glasses, cosmetics, clothing, notebooks, foreign currencies, and various personal items. Yet something immediately stood out. Every identifying label had been carefully removed. Clothing tags had been cut away. Manufacturer markings had been scraped off containers. Even the most ordinary items appeared to have been deliberately stripped of information that could reveal ownership. Detectives quickly realized they were dealing with someone who had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal her identity. As police expanded their investigation, they uncovered an even more astonishing pattern. Hotel records across Norway revealed that the woman had traveled extensively throughout the country during the months leading up to her death. More importantly, she had done so under multiple false names. Investigators eventually identified at least 8 different aliases connected to her. Movements: these names included variations presented as Belgian, French, Swiss, and German identities. At each hotel, she provided different personal details, occupations, and addresses. Witnesses frequently described her as well-dressed, intelligent, and reserved. Several hotel employees recalled that she often requested room changes, maintained unusual privacy, and avoided forming relationships with other guests. The discovery of coded notes inside her luggage deepened the mystery. One notebook contained combinations of letters and numbers that initially appeared meaningless. After extensive analysis, Norwegian investigators concluded that the codes likely represented records of her travel movements. Certain entries corresponded closely to known hotel stays and journeys between cities, yet this solution only generated new questions. Why would an ordinary tourist encode her itinerary? Why use multiple identities while traveling through a relatively peaceful European country? The coded notes suggested a level of operational security more commonly associated with intelligence work than tourism. The broader geopolitical context made such theories difficult to ignore. The year was 1970, during the height of the Cold War. Norway occupied a strategically important position on NATO's northern flank. The country's coastline, military installations, and maritime activity attracted considerable interest from both Western and Eastern intelligence agencies. Several witnesses reported seeing the woman near locations that were considered sensitive at the time. Some accounts placed her close to military facilities or areas connected to naval activity. While none of these reports conclusively proved espionage, they provided fertile ground for speculation that would persist for decades. Witness descriptions added another layer of uncertainty. People who encountered the woman offered conflicting impressions regarding her accent and nationality. Some believed she spoke German. Others detected French influences. A few suggested she may have spoken Dutch. Investigators concluded that she was multilingual and likely spent significant time in different European countries. Linguistic experts who later reviewed witness testimony generally agreed that she probably originated from somewhere in Central Europe. Yet no government, family member, or missing persons report ever successfully identified her. As authorities reconstructed her final days, they uncovered a sequence of events that seemed increasingly suspicious. Witnesses reported seeing the woman in Bergen shortly before her death. Some recalled that she appeared nervous or anxious. Others remembered observing her in the company of unidentified men. One witness later described seeing a woman matching her appearance walking through Isdalen Valley, accompanied by two men several days before her body was discovered. The reliability of these observations has been debated, but they remain among the most intriguing elements of the case. Investigators also became interested in her physical appearance. Examination of her dental work revealed unusually extensive and sophisticated treatment. At the time, forensic odontologists noted that some procedures appeared expensive and uncommon. Decades later, modern forensic specialists would revisit these records, hoping they might provide clues to her country of origin. Yet once again, the evidence produced possibilities rather than answers. Following the initial investigation, the case gradually faded from public attention. The woman was buried in February 1971 in Bergen under the designation of an unknown person. However, interest never completely disappeared. Journalists, historians, retired detectives, and amateur researchers continued examining the evidence throughout the following decades. The rise of digital archives and advances in forensic science eventually gave investigators new tools unavailable in 1970. One of the most significant developments occurred in the 2010s. Norwegian journalists working with international forensic experts launched a renewed examination of the evidence. In 2016 and 2017, scientists conducted advanced isotope analysis on the woman's teeth. This technique measures chemical signatures absorbed during childhood and can help determine where a person spent their early years. The results suggested that she likely grew up in or near southern Germany, although neighboring regions could not be excluded. Researchers also concluded that she probably moved during adolescence, indicating a potentially complex personal history that crossed national borders. DNA analysis provided additional information but failed to solve the central mystery. Genetic testing helped establish certain biological characteristics and supported some of the geographic conclusions derived from isotope studies. Yet no definitive match emerged from available databases. Despite advances that have solved many historical cold cases, the Isdal woman remained unidentified. The espionage theory continued to attract attention because several elements aligned with known intelligence practices of the Cold War era. Multiple identities, coded notes, frequent travel, concealment of personal information, and possible surveillance of strategic locations all resembled behaviors associated with intelligence operations. Some researchers pointed to similarities with known spy tradecraft documented in declassified Cold War files. Others argued that such conclusions relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. No intelligence agency has ever acknowledged any connection to the woman, and no documentary proof has emerged confirming she worked as a spy. Alternative explanations remain equally challenging. If she was not an intelligence operative, why did she systematically erase traces of her identity? If she intended to disappear voluntarily, why travel so extensively under false names? If she was murdered, who was responsible, and how did they avoid detection despite an international investigation? If she committed suicide, why create such an elaborate web of aliases and secrecy beforehand? Every proposed solution appears to answer certain questions while creating new ones. November 17, 1978, Speedway, Indiana. Just after closing time at a Burger Chef restaurant located at 5725 Crawfordsville Road, 4 young employees were preparing to end another ordinary Friday night shift. 19-year-old assistant manager Daniel Davis, 20-year-old assistant manager Jane Freet, 17-year-old Ruth Shelton, and 16-year-old Mark Flemons had no reason to believe they were about to become victims in one of America's most baffling unsolved murder cases. More than 4 decades later, investigators still cannot answer the 2 most important questions: who killed them and why? The story began shortly before midnight. Burger Chef was one of the largest fast food chains in the United States during the 1970s. Operating hundreds of locations across the country, the Speedway restaurant sat in a busy commercial area west of Indianapolis. According to company procedures, the closing crew was responsible for cleaning the restaurant, counting receipts, securing cash deposits, and preparing the store for the next morning. Witnesses later reported seeing activity inside the restaurant during the evening, and everything appeared normal. At approximately 11 p.m., customer interactions and employee activity suggested that the staff was completing routine closing duties, yet sometime between closing and the early hours of November 18, something went terribly wrong. When employees arrived the following morning to open the restaurant, they immediately noticed signs that something was unusual. A back door stood open, cash was missing from the safe, personal belongings belonging to employees remained inside. Most alarming of all, none of the 4 workers were anywhere to be found. The initial police response would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire investigation. Officers arriving at the scene reportedly believed they were dealing with a relatively straightforward robbery. Because there was no immediate evidence of violence, investigators did not initially treat the restaurant as a potential abduction scene. Employees and managers were allowed to enter portions of the building. Some cleaning and routine activity occurred before a full forensic examination could be conducted. Years later, investigators and true crime researchers would question whether critical evidence may have been destroyed during those first crucial hours. As news spread throughout Speedway, concern quickly escalated. 4 young people had vanished simultaneously. The probability that all 4 had voluntarily disappeared together seemed increasingly unlikely. Families became worried. Police began searching nearby areas. Then later that day, the case transformed from a missing person investigation into a homicide investigation. On November 18, 1978, the bodies of all 4 victims were discovered in a wooded area of Johnson County, approximately 20 miles south of Speedway, near the community of Martinsville. The location was remote enough that the victims were unlikely to have arrived there on their own. Investigators concluded that the employees had been removed from the restaurant and transported to the site by their attackers. The discovery immediately raised a disturbing question. If the motive was robbery, why abduct 4 witnesses and transport them such a considerable distance? The autopsies revealed that the victims had been murdered shortly after being taken from the restaurant. The details shocked the local community and generated significant media attention throughout Indiana. Yet even with 4 victims and a crime scene connected to a public business, investigators struggled to identify a clear suspect. The lack of forensic evidence became one of the defining characteristics of the case. As detectives reconstructed the timeline, they encountered another mystery. There appeared to be no convincing evidence of a violent struggle inside the restaurant. 4 healthy young individuals had somehow been removed from the building without attracting significant attention from nearby residents, customers, or passing motorists. Investigators began considering the possibility that the offenders had used deception, intimidation, or firearms to gain compliance. Some theorized that the victims may have believed they were being taken elsewhere temporarily and therefore did not resist immediately. Others argued that multiple offenders were almost certainly involved because controlling 4 people simultaneously would have been extremely difficult for a lone attacker. The robbery itself also raised questions. Reports indicated that money had been taken from the restaurant, but the amount was relatively small compared to the extraordinary risk involved in kidnapping 4 employees. Experienced detectives noted that most armed robberies end once cash is obtained. Transporting multiple witnesses across county lines dramatically increases the likelihood of capture and elevates criminal charges. The disproportion between the stolen money and the violence that followed has remained one of the central mysteries of the case. Throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, investigators pursued numerous leads. Witnesses reported suspicious vehicles. Others described unfamiliar individuals seen near the restaurant before closing time. Some information pointed toward local criminals known for robberies. Additional tips suggested that organized groups may have been involved, yet none of these leads produced enough evidence for prosecutors to file charges. One of the most discussed theories emerged from information provided by confidential informants and individuals connected to criminal circles in Indiana. Certain suspects allegedly participated in robbery crews operating during that period. Investigators explored whether the Burger Chef crime may have begun as a robbery that escalated unexpectedly. According to variations of this theory, the offenders may have decided that leaving witnesses alive created too much risk. However, despite years of investigation, Authorities never obtained sufficient evidence to conclusively connect any suspect to the murders. The passage of time only deepened the mystery. During the 1980s and 1990s, advances in forensic science solved many cold cases across the United States. DNA analysis, improved fingerprint databases, and computerized investigative techniques helped identify offenders in crimes once considered impossible to solve. Yet the Burger Chef murders remained stubbornly resistant to resolution. One reason was that many potentially valuable pieces of evidence either never existed, were lost, or may have been compromised during the early stages of the investigation. Another complication involved witness reliability. As years passed, memories faded. Individuals who had seen vehicles, strangers, or unusual activity on the night of November 17 provided accounts that sometimes conflicted with one another. Some witnesses changed details over time. Others became impossible to locate. Investigators found themselves trying to reconstruct a rapidly disappearing picture of events that had occurred decades earlier. The case received renewed attention in subsequent years as journalists, documentary producers, and cold case researchers revisited the evidence. Retired detectives openly acknowledged that the initial handling of the crime scene likely hindered the investigation. Modern investigators examining the file often point to those first hours as a pivotal moment. Had the restaurant been immediately secured as a potential kidnapping scene, additional fingerprints, fibers, footprints, or biological evidence might have been recovered. Yet even that explanation does not solve the deeper puzzle. Why were 4 employees targeted? Why transport them to a remote location instead of leaving them inside the restaurant? Why risk such an elaborate crime for a relatively small amount of money? And how did the offender successfully remove 4 people from a public business without generating immediate alarm? July 13, 2011. At approximately 6:45 a.m., emergency responders arrived at the historic Spreckles Mansion on Ocean Boulevard in Coronado, California. Hanging from a second-floor balcony was 32-year-old Rebecca Zahau, the girlfriend of pharmaceutical executive Jonah Shacknai. She was found nude, her wrists bound behind her back, her ankles tied, and a rope wrapped around her neck. Painted in black on a nearby door was a cryptic message. She saved him, can he save her? What should have been a straightforward death investigation instead became one of the most controversial mystery cases in modern American criminal history. More than a decade later, investigators, forensic experts, attorneys, journalists, and the public still disagree about what happened during Rebecca Zahau's final hours. The story actually began 2 days earlier. On July 11, 2011, 6-year-old Max Shacknai, the son of Jonah Shacknai, suffered a catastrophic fall from a staircase inside the same mansion. At the time of the accident, Rebecca Zahau was the only adult known to be present in the residence, along with Max and her younger sister, Xena. The circumstances of the fall immediately raised questions. Max was discovered critically injured and transported to a hospital in San Diego. Despite extensive medical treatment, he would later die from his injuries. The accident devastated everyone connected to the family and created an atmosphere of grief and tension inside the mansion. Jonah Shacknai was away from the property when Max was injured. As doctors fought to save the boy's life, Rebecca reportedly struggled with overwhelming guilt and anxiety. Investigators later argued that she felt personally responsible for the accident because she had been supervising Max at the time. Yet friends and family would later challenge that narrative, insisting that Rebecca had shown no signs of suicidal intent. Those competing interpretations would become one of the central disputes in the case. The mystery deepened dramatically during the early morning hours of July 13. Adam Shacknai, Jonah's brother, had traveled to Coronado after learning about Max's condition and was staying in a guest house on the property. According to his account, he discovered Rebecca's body hanging from the balcony shortly before sunrise. He cut her down and called 911. Investigators quickly secured the scene and began documenting what appeared to be one of the most unusual death investigations in recent California history. Several aspects of the scene immediately stood out. Rebecca's hands were bound behind her back with rope. Her ankles were tied. A t-shirt had been placed in her mouth. The balcony railing stood several feet above the courtyard where her body was found. Investigators also discovered the now famous message painted on a door near the balcony. Even experienced detectives described the circumstances as bizarre. The question that emerged almost immediately was simple. Had Rebecca Zahow taken her own life, or had someone staged the scene to look like a suicide? On September 2, 2011, after weeks of investigation, San Diego County Sheriff Bill Gore announced the official conclusion. Max Shacknai's death was ruled an accident. Rebecca Zahow's death was ruled a suicide. Investigators stated that physical evidence suggested she had bound herself, placed the gag in her mouth, climbed over the balcony railing, and hanged herself. Authorities argued that the emotional burden of Max's accident provided a motive. They even produced a demonstration showing how someone could tie their own wrists behind their back using a rope system similar to the one found at the scene. Yet instead of ending the mystery, the ruling intensified it. Rebecca's family immediately rejected the conclusion. They pointed to the unusual bindings, the gag, the absence of a conventional suicide note, and the strange painted message. Her relatives argued that the scene looked more consistent with homicide than suicide. Her former husband publicly stated that the message on the door did not resemble something Rebecca would write. Family members also questioned why a woman with strong religious beliefs and future plans would suddenly take her own life in such a complex and theatrical manner. The autopsy generated even more controversy. Medical examiners documented multiple injuries to Rebecca's head. Official investigators suggested these injuries could have occurred as her body struck portions of the balcony structure during the fall. However, independent experts hired by the family disagreed. Among them was renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Vecht, who testified that certain injuries appeared inconsistent with suicide and argued that the death should be considered a homicide. Other forensic consultants questioned whether the pattern of injuries could realistically be explained by an accidental impact during a hanging event. Another mystery involved the message itself. She saved him, can he save her? Investigators never identified a definitive explanation for its meaning. Authorities believed Rebecca wrote it herself. Family members disputed that conclusion and argued that the handwriting and language did not fit her style. The message remains one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the case because it can be interpreted in radically different ways, depending on which theory one accepts. The investigation also examined Rebecca's phone records, text messages, and communications from the final evening of her life. Records showed that she exchanged messages with family members and received communications related to Max's deteriorating medical condition. Investigators hoped digital evidence might reveal suicidal intent, evidence of outside involvement, or signs of a struggle. Ultimately, authorities reported that additional forensic examinations of her phone produced no evidence sufficient to alter their conclusion. For several years, the case appeared settled officially, but not publicly. Online investigators, journalists, forensic analysts, and true crime communities continued dissecting every detail. The unusual scene, conflicting expert opinions, and unanswered questions ensured that the case never disappeared from public attention. Many observers found it difficult to reconcile the official ruling with the visual reality of the scene. Others argued that unusual suicides do occur and that emotional trauma can lead people to behave in unexpected ways. The biggest twist arrived in 2018. Rebecca Zahow's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit focusing on Adam Shacknai. Unlike a criminal trial, a civil proceeding requires a lower standard of proof. After hearing testimony from competing experts and reviewing years of evidence, a San Diego civil jury reached a stunning conclusion. In April 2018, jurors found Adam Shacknai responsible for Rebecca Zahow's death and awarded her family more than $5 million in damages. The verdict shocked legal observers because it directly contradicted the official conclusion reached by law enforcement years earlier. For the first time, two dramatically different conclusions existed side by side. According to the sheriff's department and medical examiner, Rebecca Zahow died by suicide. According to a civil jury, Adam Shacknai bore responsibility for her death. Both conclusions were based on examinations of largely the same evidence. That contradiction transformed the case from a controversial death investigation into one of the most debated mysteries in modern America. The civil verdict prompted authorities to conduct another review. Investigators who had not participated in the original case re-examined the evidence. The medical examiner's office also performed a new review of the findings. In November 2018, officials announced that they saw no reason to change the original ruling. Once again, Rebecca Zahow's manner of death was officially classified as suicide. Further legal developments added yet another layer of complexity. Adam Shacknai appealed the civil verdict, Before the appeal process fully concluded, a settlement was reached that resulted in the dismissal of the civil case and vacated the original monetary judgment. Supporters of each side interpreted that outcome differently. Some viewed it as a legal technicality. Others argued it weakened the significance of the jury's earlier finding. The disagreement ensured that public debate would continue. The Cleveland torso murders remain one of the most disturbing unsolved serial murder cases in American history. Between 1935 and 1938, a killer later nicknamed the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run terrorized Cleveland, Ohio, leaving behind a trail of mutilated bodies that shocked the nation and humiliated one of America's most famous lawmen. More than 80 years later, no one has ever been convicted. Many of the victims remain unidentified, and the true identity of the murderer is still debated. The case unfolded during the depths of the Great Depression, a period when thousands of unemployed men and women drifted through industrial cities, searching for work. One of the poorest areas in Cleveland was Kingsbury Run, a ravine filled with railroad tracks, makeshift shanties, and homeless camps. Local newspapers described it as a refuge for society's forgotten people. It was here that the killer found most of his victims. According to records preserved by the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History and the Cleveland Police Museum, the officially recognized murders occurred between September 1935 and August 1938, although some researchers believe the total number of victims may have exceeded 20. Most victims were transients, laborers, or individuals living on the margins of society, making identification extremely difficult. The investigation truly began on September 23, 1935, when two mutilated bodies were discovered in Kingsbury Run. One victim was later identified through fingerprints as 29-year-old Edward Andrassy, a local hospital orderly. The second victim was never identified. Both had been decapitated. Investigators quickly realized they were not dealing with an ordinary homicide. 4 months later, on January 26, 1936, the remains of another victim were discovered near Orange Avenue. She was identified as Florence Genevieve Polillo, a waitress known in the local area. Like the previous victims, she had been decapitated and dismembered. As additional bodies appeared over the next 2 years, investigators noticed a horrifying pattern. Every victim had been decapitated. Many had been dismembered with remarkable precision. Several male victims had been castrated. In some cases, portions of the bodies appeared to have been treated with chemicals that altered the skin. Forensic investigators of the era struggled to determine causes of death because many remains had been exposed to the elements for months before discovery. The heads were often missing, eliminating one of the most important methods of identification available in the 1930s. As public fear spread throughout Cleveland, increasing pressure fell upon the city's director of public safety, Eliot Ness. Ness was already a national celebrity. During Prohibition, he had led the famous Untouchables and played a major role in the campaign against Chicago. Gangster Al Capone. Newspapers expected him to solve the murders quickly. Instead, the case became the greatest failure of his career. Ness threw enormous resources into the investigation. Historical records indicate that authorities questioned approximately 100 people during the hunt for the killer. Detectives searched boarding houses, rail yards, homeless camps, and industrial districts. Informants were recruited. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, yet the murders continued. One of the most controversial moments occurred in August 1938. Frustrated by the inability to stop the killings and believing the transient camps provided both victims and hiding places for the murderer, Ness ordered large sections of the Kingsbury Run shantytowns evacuated and burned. Officially, the action was presented as a public health and safety measure. Critics argued it was a desperate attempt to demonstrate progress. The operation displaced hundreds of homeless residents, generated national headlines, and damaged Ness's reputation. Yet even after such drastic measures, investigators still failed to identify the killer. The most chilling development came only days later. On August 16, 1938, the remains of 2 more victims were discovered near East 9th Street. According to multiple historical accounts, the location was within view of Ness's office. Many researchers believe the placement was intentional, as if the killer were directly mocking the man leading the investigation. The message was clear. Despite every raid, search, and interrogation, the murderer remained untouchable. The discovery intensified public outrage and transformed the case into a personal battle between the unknown killer and Cleveland's most famous crime fighter. Over the course of the investigation, two suspects emerged above all others. The first was Frank Dolezal, a Cleveland laborer who had connections to several victims, including Florence Polillo. In 1939, Dolezal confessed to killing Polillo but later retracted the confession, claiming it had been extracted through physical abuse. Before the case could be fully examined in court, Dolezal was found hanging in his jail cell. Authorities ruled the death a suicide, however. Questions immediately arose. Reports indicated he had suffered multiple broken ribs while in custody. Rumors spread that he had been silenced. Subsequent investigations ultimately cleared Dolezal of responsibility for the torso murders, but the circumstances surrounding his death remain controversial. Contemporary coverage appeared in the New York Times on July 8, 1939, after authorities announced his confession. The second suspect was far more intriguing. Dr. Francis Edward Sweeney was a World War I veteran and trained physician who had served in medical units performing battlefield amputations. He possessed exactly the kind of anatomical knowledge many investigators believed the killer demonstrated. By the mid-1930s, Sweeney suffered from severe alcoholism, psychological problems, and a deteriorating personal life. Eliot Ness personally focused on him as a suspect. Historical accounts indicate that Sweeney underwent 2 early polygraph examinations administered by Leonard Keeler, one of the pioneers of lie detection technology. Keeler reportedly told Ness that he believed Sweeney was responsible, yet there was a major problem. Polygraph results were not admissible evidence, and virtually all evidence against Sweeney remained circumstantial. Ness feared he could not secure a conviction. Complicating matters further, Sweeney was related to influential political figures who were already hostile toward Ness. Without sufficient evidence, prosecutors refused to proceed. The lead mask's case is one of the strangest unsolved deaths ever investigated in Brazil. Nearly 60 years after 2 men were found dead on a hillside overlooking the city of Niterói, investigators still cannot explain why they died, what they were attempting to accomplish, or why they chose to wear homemade lead masks during their final hours. Unlike many famous mysteries that rely on rumors, legends, or decades of exaggerated storytelling, this case is built upon documented police reports, witness statements, newspaper coverage, and physical evidence recovered at the scene. Yet every confirmed fact seems to create another unanswered question. On August 20, 1966, 18-year-old Jorge da Costa Alves was flying a kite on Morro do Vintém, a hill in Niterói across Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro, when he noticed 2 motionless bodies lying in the grass. Police officers arriving at the location identified the dead men as Miguel José Viana, age 34, and Manuel Pereira da Cruz, age 32, both electronics technicians from the town of Campos dos Goitacazes, approximately 280 kilometers away. The scene immediately puzzled investigators. The men were lying side by side. Both were dressed in formal suits despite the warm weather. Neither showed signs of violence. No weapon was found nearby. Most strikingly, each man wore a strange mask made from lead sheets shaped to cover the eyes while leaving the rest of the face exposed. The unusual appearance of the bodies quickly attracted media attention throughout Brazil. The investigation soon revealed an even stranger sequence of events. On August 17, 3 days before the bodies were discovered, Viana and Cruz told their families they were traveling to Sao Paulo to purchase electronic components for work. Evidence later showed that they instead traveled to Niterói. Witnesses confirmed seeing the pair arrive in the city carrying a significant amount of cash. One key witness was Maria Silva, a waitress who reported serving the men at a local bar near Morro do Vintém. She later told investigators that the two appeared nervous and repeatedly checked the time. Another important witness, a sales clerk, confirmed selling them a bottle of mineral water shortly before they headed toward the hill. The purchase seemed ordinary at first, but it later became one of the final confirmed actions of the 2 men before their deaths. When police examined their belongings, they discovered a handwritten note that became the central mystery of the case. Written in Portuguese, the instructions read, 16:30 be at the specified location, 18:30 ingest capsules, after effect protect metals, await signal mask. Investigators immediately focused on the cryptic message because it appeared to describe a planned sequence of actions. Yet no one could determine exactly what the instructions meant. The note contained no explanation of the capsules, the signal, or the purpose of the masks. Family members stated that the handwriting belonged to one of the victims, suggesting that the men had willingly participated in whatever event was supposed to occur that evening. As detectives dug deeper into the backgrounds of the victims, they uncovered connections to a small community interested in spiritualism and experimental electronic communication. During the 1960s, Brazil experienced widespread interest in spiritism, a movement influenced by the teachings of Allan Kardec. Some enthusiasts believed electronic devices could be used to contact non-physical entities. Friends and acquaintances described Viana and Cruz as intelligent electronics technicians who spent considerable time building radios and experimenting with electronic equipment. According to statements collected during the investigation, the men had participated in discussions involving psychic phenomena and attempts to receive messages from beyond the physical world. These revelations fueled speculation that the note referred to some kind of spiritual experiment rather than a criminal conspiracy. One witness account added another layer to the mystery. Several local residents later reported seeing an unusual bright object above Morro do Vintém around the time the men were believed to have died. Among the most cited testimonies was that of Gracinda Souza, who claimed she observed a glowing orange object hovering over the hill before suddenly accelerating away. Brazilian newspapers extensively reported these sightings in the days following the discovery of the bodies, helping transform the case into one of the country's most famous UFO mysteries. However, investigators found no physical evidence connecting the alleged lights to the deaths. The reports remained eyewitness testimony rather than verifiable proof. The greatest obstacle facing authorities was the condition of the bodies. By the time they were discovered, decomposition had advanced significantly due to weather conditions. Forensic examiners attempted to determine a cause of death, but the available technology and the state of the remains made definitive conclusions impossible. Toxicological testing was severely limited. No obvious trauma was present, no gunshot wounds, stab wounds, or fractures were identified. The official autopsy ultimately failed to establish how either man died. This single fact transformed the case from a suspicious death investigation into a permanent mystery. Without a known cause of death, nearly every theory remained possible. Police considered poisoning as one explanation. The reference to capsules in the note suggested that the men may have ingested some substance shortly before death. Yet no capsules were recovered at the scene. No packaging was found. No chemical evidence survived long enough for investigators to identify a toxin. Another possibility was accidental overdose during an experiment involving drugs or hallucinogens. Again, there was no physical evidence capable of confirming such a scenario. Detectives also explored the possibility of homicide. However, the absence of injuries, defensive wounds, robbery, or signs of struggle made murder difficult to prove. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The cash carried by the men was reportedly gone, but investigators could not determine whether it had been spent before death or removed afterward. Brazilian newspapers, including Jornal do Brasil and O Cruzeiro, followed the investigation closely, publishing interviews, witness statements, and speculation from investigators. As public interest grew, theories multiplied. Some suggested the men were participating in a secret scientific experiment. Others believed they expected contact with extraterrestrials. Skeptics argued that the deaths were the result of a failed spiritual ritual combined with voluntary ingestion of an unknown substance. Despite years of discussion, no explanation successfully accounted for every known fact. The lead masks themselves remained especially difficult to explain. Their design appeared deliberate, yet no clear reason existed for shielding only the eyes. If the men expected a bright flash of light, the masks might make sense. If they were protecting themselves from radiation, the design seemed inadequate. If the masks served a symbolic role in a ritual, no surviving evidence explained the symbolism. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse mystery began with something that should never have happened. On the evening of December 15, 1900, the crew of the steamer Archer passed the remote Flannan Isles in the North Atlantic and noticed that the lighthouse on Eilean Moor was dark. For ships navigating the dangerous waters west of Scotland, the light served as a critical guide through one of the most unforgiving stretches of coastline in Europe. A temporary failure was possible, but what no one aboard the vessel could have imagined was that the darkness signaled the beginning of one of the strangest disappearances in British history. By the time investigators reached the island 11 days later, 3 experienced lighthouse keepers had vanished without leaving behind a single confirmed clue explaining what happened to them. Eilean Mor was never an easy place to live, rising from the Atlantic approximately 20 miles west of the Isle of Lewis in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. The island consisted of steep cliffs, exposed rock faces, and relentless ocean winds capable of transforming calm seas into violent walls of water within hours. The lighthouse had only entered service in December 1899 under the supervision of the Northern Lighthouse Board. Its purpose was simple: prevent ships from crashing into the dangerous reefs and cliffs that had claimed countless vessels over previous centuries. Maintaining the station required a small crew willing to spend weeks isolated from the rest of the world while storms battered the island from every direction. During December 1900, the station was staffed by principal keeper James Ducat, assistant keeper Thomas Marshall, and occasional keeper Donald MacArthur. None of the men were inexperienced. Ducat had served for years within the lighthouse service. Marshall possessed extensive maritime knowledge and had worked at several stations before arriving on Eilean Mor. MacArthur, a former seaman, was known as a physically strong and resilient individual capable of handling difficult conditions. If any 3 men could be expected to manage the dangers of a remote Atlantic lighthouse, it was them. The first indication that something was wrong came from the Archtor on December 15. Captain Holman later reported that the lighthouse light was not visible, despite weather conditions that should have allowed it to be seen. Because communication with the island was impossible and severe weather delayed scheduled transport, no immediate inspection occurred. Days passed. The lighthouse remained unattended. Unknown to everyone on the mainland, whatever had happened to the 3 keepers had already taken place. Relief finally arrived on December 26 when the vessel Hesperus approached the island carrying replacement keeper Joseph Moore. Captain James Harvey immediately noticed something unusual. No flag had been raised from the station. No one appeared on the landing platform. No figure stood waiting near the path. Under normal circumstances, lighthouse keepers eagerly watched for supply vessels because they represented the only connection to the outside world. The silence that greeted the Hesperus felt deeply wrong. Moore later described an uneasy feeling as he climbed the steep path toward the lighthouse. The main gate was closed. The entrance door was locked. Everything appeared strangely normal. Inside, however, the absence of human activity became impossible to ignore. The men were nowhere to be found. Their beds indicated that they had risen from sleep and begun their daily routines. The kitchen showed no sign of violence. The lamps had been cleaned and prepared. The clocks remained operational. Nothing suggested panic, struggle, or an attempt to abandon the station. It looked as though 3 men had simply stepped outside and never returned. A thorough search of the island began immediately. Every accessible section of coastline was examined. Cliff tops were inspected, paths were checked. No bodies were discovered. No personal belongings were found. No evidence indicated that a boat had left the island. The search produced only one significant lead, and it came from the western landing area, a location used to move supplies from boats to the island during calmer weather. Investigators found extensive storm damage unlike anything expected from ordinary seas. A large storage box positioned high above the waterline had been shattered. Iron railings were bent and twisted. Heavy equipment had been displaced. Ropes as normally secured to the landing had vanished. According to reports later reviewed by Northern Lighthouse Board Superintendent Robert Muirhead, some of the damage occurred more than 100 feet above sea level. The findings suggested that enormous waves had struck the island with extraordinary force. Muirhead traveled personally to Eilean Mor to conduct the official investigation. After studying the scene, interviewing witnesses, and reviewing available evidence, he proposed a reconstruction of events that remains the most widely accepted explanation. Today, he believed 1 keeper had gone to inspect storm damage near the western landing. A 2nd keeper may have joined him. The 3rd, observing danger from above, likely rushed outside to help. At that moment, an exceptionally large wave may have surged across the rocks and swept all 3 men into the Atlantic before any of them could reach safety. The theory sounds reasonable until one begins examining the details more closely. Lighthouse regulations generally required at least 1 keeper to remain inside the station at all times. Why would all 3 men leave simultaneously? Why would experienced personnel expose themselves to dangerous conditions together? The question becomes even more puzzling when considering that one set of outdoor waterproof gear reportedly remained inside the lighthouse. If accurate, this would suggest that at least one man hurried outside without fully dressing for severe weather, something seasoned lighthouse keepers rarely did unless they believed an emergency demanded immediate action. As news of the disappearance spread across Britain, newspapers quickly transformed the event into a national sensation. Stories began appearing that described half-eaten meals left on tables, overturned chairs, and mysterious final logbook entries describing terrifying storms and emotional distress among the keepers. Yet historians who later examined official documents discovered that many of these famous details could not be verified. No authentic records contain several of the dramatic quotations frequently repeated in books and documentaries. Over time, legend became intertwined with fact, making the mystery even more difficult to unravel. The isolation of the Flannan Isles helped fuel increasingly strange theories. Local folklore had long portrayed the islands as unusual places associated with supernatural traditions. Some islanders reportedly believed unseen forces inhabited the area. Others avoided remaining on the islands overnight. Following the disappearance, speculation expanded far beyond maritime accident theories. Some suggested the men had encountered unknown visitors. Others proposed murder, espionage, or supernatural intervention. None of these explanations produced evidence capable of matching the physical facts uncovered during the investigation. April 25, 1848. Somewhere on the frozen shores of King William Island in the Canadian Arctic, 105 exhausted British sailors abandoned two of the most advanced exploration ships ever built. Their commander, Sir John Franklin, had already been dead for nearly a year. 24 crew members had perished. Food supplies were running low. The ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had been trapped in ice since September 1846. Faced with almost certain death, the survivors began a desperate march south across one of the harshest environments on Earth. None of them would ever be seen alive again. What happened after that moment remains one of the greatest mysteries in exploration history. Unlike many historical disappearances that left almost no evidence, the Franklin expedition left behind graves, skeletons, abandoned equipment, written messages, eyewitness accounts, and eventually even the ships themselves. Yet nearly 180 years later, historians, archaeologists, forensic scientists, and polar researchers still cannot fully reconstruct the expedition's final months. The evidence tells a story of starvation, disease, extreme weather, and human desperation. But crucial pieces of the puzzle remain missing. The story began 3 years earlier. On May 19, 1845, Sir John Franklin departed Greenhithe, England, with 129 officers and crew aboard HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The mission was organized by the British Admiralty to complete the final unmapped section of the Northwest Passage, the long-sought Arctic sea route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Franklin was 60 years old and one of Britain's most experienced Arctic explorers. The expedition carried approximately 3 years of provisions, including more than 8,000 tins of preserved food supplied by contractor Stephen Goldner. The ships were equipped with steam engines adapted from railway locomotives, reinforced hulls, central heating systems, and technology considered revolutionary for the time. Many believed the expedition represented the pinnacle of British naval engineering. The last confirmed sighting occurred on July 26, 1845. Captains of the whaling vessels Prince of Wales and Enterprise encountered the expedition in Baffin Bay. According to their reports, Franklin's ships were waiting for favorable ice conditions before entering Lancaster Sound. After that encounter, the expedition disappeared. Months turned into years with no news. By 1848, concern within Britain had grown into alarm. The Admiralty launched rescue missions while Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, mounted an extraordinary campaign to keep the search alive. Over the following decades, more than 40 expeditions searched the Arctic, making the hunt for Franklin one of the largest rescue efforts in exploration history. The first major clue emerged in 1850 when search teams discovered 3 graves on Beechey Island. The graves belonged to John Torrington, William Braine, and John Hartnell, all members of Franklin's expedition who died during the first Arctic winter of 1845 to 1846. The graves confirmed that the expedition had reached the region but revealed little else. The real breakthrough came in 1859 when Captain Francis Leopold McClintock discovered a written message inside a stone cairn near Victory Point on King William Island. The note contained two entries. The first, dated May 28, 1847, reported that the expedition was wintering successfully. The second, added on April 25, 1848, painted a far darker picture. It stated that Sir John Franklin had died on June 11, 1847. It also revealed that Erebus and Terror had remained trapped in ice for 19 months. Most importantly, it announced that the surviving crew had abandoned the ships and intended to march south toward the Back River. What followed is where the mystery truly begins. Inuit hunters living in the region later described encounters with starving white men dragging sledges and boats across the ice. Some witnesses reported seeing bodies scattered along the coastline. Others described men collapsing from exhaustion while attempting to travel south. Scottish explorer John Ray collected many of these testimonies during the 1850s. His reports suggested that the expedition's final survivors had succumbed to starvation and exposure. However, British society largely rejected Inuit accounts. Many Victorian officials considered the reports unreliable and refused to believe that Royal Navy sailors could have deteriorated to such a state. One claim in particular generated outrage. Inuit witnesses told Ray that some members of the expedition had resorted to cannibalism during their final days. When Ray reported this information in 1854, public reaction was immediate. Author Charles Dickens publicly attacked the claim, arguing that British sailors would never consume their dead companions. For more than a century, the accusation remained controversial. Then science intervened. Beginning in the 1980s, anthropologist Dr. Owen Beatty and his team examined human remains recovered from King William Island. The bones displayed cut marks, fractures, and breakage patterns consistent with butchering. Further studies published in scientific journals found evidence that marrow had been extracted from bones, a common survival practice during extreme starvation. Modern forensic analysis ultimately confirmed that at least some crew members had resorted to cannibalism in a desperate attempt to survive. The cause of the expedition's collapse remains another unresolved mystery. For decades, lead poisoning dominated discussions. In 1984, Beatty exhumed the body of John Torrington from Beechey Island. The sailor's body was remarkably preserved by Arctic permafrost. Laboratory analysis revealed elevated concentrations of lead in soft tissue and hair samples. Researchers theorized that poorly soldered food cans contaminated the expedition's provisions. The theory became widely accepted and appeared in numerous documentaries and scientific publications. However, later studies challenged the conclusion. Research led by scientists including Dr. Douglas Stenton found that elevated lead exposure was relatively common among 19th century sailors and may not have been severe enough to explain the disaster. Most researchers now believe that multiple factors contributed to the tragedy, including malnutrition, scurvy, pneumonia, tuberculosis, hypothermia, and the brutal Arctic environment itself. 10 weeks. That was all it took for an unknown killer to transform an ordinary American city into a place ruled by fear. Between February and May of 1946, residents of Texarkana, a city divided by the border of Texas and Arkansas, locked their doors before sunset, armed themselves with shotguns, and watched strangers with suspicion. Young couples stopped meeting at lovers' lanes. Families slept with loaded weapons beside their beds. Police officers, Texas Rangers, county deputies, and armed volunteers searched desperately for a man they could not identify. The newspapers gave him a name, the Phantom Killer. The name was fitting because the murderer seemed to appear from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. He attacked under the cover of darkness, left behind dead and wounded victims, triggered one of the largest manhunts in the region's history, and then vanished forever. No arrest, no confession, no trial. More than 80 years later, investigators still cannot say with certainty who committed the Texarkana Moonlight murders. The greatest mystery is not how the killings began. The mystery is how a serial killer apparently stopped after terrorizing an entire city and was never seen again. In early 1946, Texarkana was experiencing the optimism that swept across much of the United States following the end of World War II. Thousands of servicemen had returned home, businesses were expanding, life appeared to be returning to normal. Few people could have imagined that one of America's most enduring unsolved murder mysteries was about to unfold in their community. The first known attack occurred on the night of February 22, 1946. 19-year-old Jimmy Hollis and 19-year-old Mary Jean Larry were parked on a secluded road commonly used by local couples. At approximately 11:45 p.m., a man approached their vehicle. According to statements later provided to investigators, the stranger wore what appeared to be a white mask or hood with cutouts for the eyes. Hollis initially assumed he was dealing with a police officer. Seconds later, the situation turned violent. The attacker ordered both occupants out of the vehicle, struck Hollis repeatedly with a pistol, and brutally assaulted Larry before fleeing. Both victims survived and became the first witnesses to the figure who would later be known nationwide as the Phantom Killer. Police immediately launched an investigation, but the case presented serious challenges. The attack occurred at night. The assailant concealed his face. The victims could offer only a limited description. Hollis estimated that the man stood roughly 6 feet tall and appeared to be a white male. Beyond that, investigators had little to work with. No arrest followed. The case might have faded into local crime reports if not for what happened 1 month later. On March 24, 1946, the bodies of 29-year-old Richard Griffin and 17-year-old Polly Ann Moore were discovered inside Griffin's car along an isolated road. Outside Texarkana, both had been shot to death. They had last been seen the previous evening. Investigators quickly noticed disturbing similarities between the murders and the earlier assault. Once again, the victims were a young couple. Once again, they had been parked in a remote location after dark. Newspapers across the region began speculating that a serial offender might be responsible. Public concern rapidly intensified. The fear became panic less than 3 weeks later. Shortly after midnight on April 13, 16-year-old Betty Jo Booker finished performing with her saxophone at a dance held at the VFW Club. She accepted a ride home from 25-year-old Paul Martin. Neither arrived. Hours later, Martin's body was found beside a road. Booker's body was discovered nearly 2 miles away. Both had been shot multiple times. The murders shocked the community. Booker was well known locally as a talented musician. Her death generated extensive newspaper coverage, while investigators struggled to explain how the killer had once again escaped detection. By this point, the Texarkana Gazette and other regional newspapers were reporting developments almost daily. The killer's ability to strike repeatedly without leaving enough evidence for an arrest began fueling rumors and speculation. Citizens formed armed patrols. Hardware stores reported increased firearm sales. According to contemporary accounts, some residents refused to leave their homes after dark. Law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions joined the investigation. Local police worked alongside county officers, Arkansas authorities, Texas Rangers, and federal agencies. Hundreds of tips flooded into police stations. Most led nowhere. Then the case took an unexpected turn. During the early morning hours of May 3, 1946, the Phantom Killer appeared to change his methods completely. Virgil Starks and his wife Katie were inside their farmhouse approximately 10 miles. Outside Texarkana, Virgil sat reading when bullets suddenly blasted through a rear window. He was struck in the head and killed almost instantly. Katie rushed toward the telephone but was shot in the face. Despite severe injuries, she escaped the house and reached a nearby residence where she obtained help. Unlike previous attacks involving couples in isolated vehicles, this crime occurred inside a private home. Investigators immediately questioned whether the same offender was responsible. Yet because the attack occurred within the same time frame and generated similar fear, authorities included it in the growing series. The Starks murder would become the final confirmed attack associated with the Phantom Killer. After May 3, the violence stopped. No additional murders fitting the pattern occurred. No threatening letters appeared. No suspect was caught attempting another attack. The killer simply disappeared. This sudden ending remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the entire case. Many serial offenders continue escalating until they are arrested, die, relocate, or become physically incapable of offending. The Phantom Killer appeared to vanish voluntarily. Investigators eventually focused much of their attention on a career criminal named Ewell Swinney. Swinney possessed an extensive criminal record and attracted suspicion after statements provided by his wife, Peggy Swinney. Several investigators, including legendary Texas Ranger Captain Manuel T. Gonzalez, reportedly became convinced that Swinney was responsible for the murders. Gonzalez, known throughout Texas as the Lone Wolf, was one of the most respected lawmen of his generation. His opinion carried significant weight. Yet belief and proof are not the same thing. Prosecutors lacked sufficient admissible evidence to charge Swinney with the murders. Physical evidence was limited. Witnesses could not positively identify him. Forensic science in 1946 lacked many tools available to modern investigators. Although Swinney was later imprisoned for other crimes, he never faced conviction for the Texarkana murders. The years that followed only deepened the mystery. Some researchers argued that investigators had correctly identified the killer but failed to prove it. Others suggested that law enforcement focused too heavily on Swinney and ignored alternative suspects. Questions emerged about whether all 4 attacks had truly been committed by the same individual. The farmhouse murder differed significantly from the earlier Lover's Lane attacks. Ballistic evidence from the era was incomplete. Some witness statements contained inconsistencies. The passage of time only made answers more difficult to obtain. In 1976, the release of The Town That Dreaded Sundown introduced the case to a new generation. Inspired by the murders, the film transformed the Phantom Killer into one of America's most recognizable true crime legends. Although the movie dramatized events and added fictional elements, it preserved public fascination with the mystery. The image of a masked killer stalking victims beneath the moonlight became permanently associated with Texarkana. Dorothy Kilgallen was a woman who made a career out of asking questions that other people were afraid to ask. By the autumn of 1965, she was one of the most recognizable journalists in America. Millions knew her as a panelist on the television program, What's My Line? While millions more read her nationally syndicated newspaper column, Voice of Broadway. She had interviewed celebrities, politicians, criminals, and world leaders. Throughout her career, she built a reputation for obtaining information that others could not. Yet on November 8, 1965, Dorothy Kilgallen was found dead at the age of 52 inside her Manhattan townhouse, and more than 60 years later, debate continues over whether her death was simply the result of a tragic overdose or whether it was connected to one of the most controversial investigations in American history. What makes the case so enduring is not merely the circumstances of her death. It is the fact that she died while actively pursuing leads related to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, a case that was already generating suspicion across the United States. Dorothy Mae Kilgallen was born in Chicago in 1913 and grew up in a newspaper family. Her father, James Kilgallen, worked as a reporter for the Hearst newspaper chain. Following in his footsteps, she entered journalism at a young age and quickly demonstrated exceptional reporting skills. During the 1930s, she became known for an around-the-world reporting race organized by the New York Journal-American. Over the following decades, she established herself as one of America's most influential female journalists. By the 1950s and early 1960s, her column appeared in newspapers across the country. Unlike many entertainment columnists, Kilgallen frequently covered crime, politics, and courtroom proceedings. Her reputation was built on sources, access, and persistence. Former colleagues often described her as someone who rarely abandoned a story once she believed there was more to uncover. The event that would ultimately become central to discussions about her death began on November 22, 1963, when President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Within 2 days, the man accused of killing Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald, was himself shot and killed inside the Dallas police headquarters by nightclub owner Jack Ruby. The extraordinary sequence of events shocked the nation. As investigations unfolded, Kilgallen became one of the few nationally known journalists who publicly expressed doubts about the official narrative. While she reported on developments in her newspaper column, she also pursued her own independent investigation. According to several of her published articles, she believed important questions remained unanswered regarding Oswald Ruby and the broader circumstances surrounding the assassination. One of the most significant moments occurred during Ruby's 1964 murder trial in Dallas. Contemporary newspaper accounts confirmed that Kilgallen attended portions of the proceedings. During the trial, she managed to secure a private interview with Jack Ruby. The exact contents of that conversation have never been fully documented. What is known comes primarily from Kilgallen's own published comments afterward. In a column written following the interview, she suggested that she had obtained information unavailable to other reporters, and indicated that the full story surrounding the assassination had not yet emerged. She famously wrote words that have been quoted for decades: "This story isn't going to die as long as there's a real reporter alive." Because she was apparently the only journalist to have obtained a private interview with Ruby during the trial, speculation about what he may have told her would later become a major element of the mystery. Throughout 1964 and 1965, Kilgallen continued writing about the Kennedy assassination and the findings of the Warren Commission, the federal body established by President Lyndon B. Johnson to investigate Kennedy's death. The Warren Commission published its final report in September 1964 and concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Kilgallen was among the journalists who questioned aspects of the commission's conclusions. Her newspaper columns revealed that she maintained contact with sources connected to the investigation and continued gathering information long after. Many media organizations had shifted attention elsewhere. Friends and associates later recalled that she believed she was working on material that could challenge parts of the official account. However, exactly what evidence she possessed remains uncertain because no complete collection of her investigative files has ever surfaced. On the morning of November 8, 1965, Dorothy Kilgallen was discovered dead in her Manhattan home located at 45 East 68th Street. According to contemporary reports from newspapers including the New York Times, she was found in a bedroom on the second floor of the townhouse. The circumstances immediately attracted attention because members of her family later indicated that the room was not the one she normally used for sleeping. Authorities conducted an investigation and eventually concluded that she had died from a combination of alcohol and barbiturates. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental. At the time, prescription sleeping medications containing barbiturates were commonly used in the United States, and accidental overdoses were not rare. Officially, the case appeared closed, yet questions emerged almost immediately. Some friends reportedly told investigators that Kilgallen had appeared energetic and professionally active in the days before her death. Others stated that she was working on multiple projects and future television appearances. In later years, researchers examining the case pointed to inconsistencies among recollections from various witnesses. Some accounts suggested she had returned home late after attending social events. Others focused on details regarding who discovered the body and the precise condition of the bedroom. While none of these issues constituted proof of foul play, they contributed to a growing perception that important details remained unresolved. Perhaps the most frequently discussed mystery concerns her investigative notes. Over the years, several writers and researchers claimed that materials connected to Kilgallen's Kennedy investigation could not be located after her death. Among the items frequently mentioned were notes from her interview with Jack Ruby and drafts connected to a planned book about the assassination. The evidence surrounding these missing documents is complicated. There is no official inventory proving exactly what documents existed at the time of her death. However, multiple individuals familiar with her work later stated that they expected certain files to be present and were unable to find them. Because of Kilgallen's reputation for meticulous reporting, the alleged disappearance of research materials became one of the most enduring aspects of the case. Another factor fueling speculation was the broader historical context. During the mid-1960s, public confidence in official explanations surrounding the Kennedy assassination was already beginning to erode. Polls conducted in subsequent years showed large portions of the American public doubting that Oswald acted alone. As conspiracy theories multiplied, Kilgallen's death increasingly became incorporated into those narratives. Some authors argued that she had been silenced because of what she learned from Jack Ruby. Others suggested that powerful interests feared information she was preparing to publish. However, despite decades of investigation by journalists, historians, and independent researchers, no verifiable evidence has emerged proving that she was murdered. The most credible evidence still points toward the official conclusion. Contemporary medical records indicate the presence of barbiturates and alcohol. No conclusive forensic evidence of homicide was identified. No witness ever came forward with first-hand knowledge of a murder plot. No recovered document has revealed a secret discovery that could explain a motive for killing her. Even many researchers who find the circumstances suspicious acknowledge that the available evidence falls short of establishing criminal responsibility. At the same time, skeptics of the official explanation argue that the absence of key documents and unanswered questions surrounding her final investigation prevent a definitive resolution. What makes the Dorothy Kilgallen case remarkable is that both sides of the debate rely heavily on what cannot be proven. Supporters of the accidental overdose conclusion point to the medical examiner's findings and the lack of direct evidence of foul play. Those who suspect something more sinister point to the timing of her death, her continuing Kennedy investigation, her unique access to Jack Ruby, and the reported disappearance of research materials. More than 6 decades later, neither side has produced evidence capable of ending the controversy. 2 children disappeared from the most famous fortress in England, and someone became king shortly afterward. More than 500 years have passed, governments have risen and fallen, dynasties have disappeared, and entire libraries have been written about the case. Yet nobody can say with certainty what happened inside the Tower of London during the summer of 1483. There was no public execution, no official announcement, no funeral, no grave identified beyond doubt. One day the boys were seen playing behind the stone walls of the royal fortress. Then they vanished. Their disappearance transformed the political future of England, helped launch a new royal dynasty, and created one of the oldest cold cases in recorded history. Historians still argue over the same questions that haunted London more than 5 centuries ago. Were the boys murdered? If so, who ordered it? Was it their uncle, a future king, a political rival, or someone whose name never entered the historical record? The mystery became known as the Princes in the Tower, and despite centuries of investigation, it remains unsolved. The story began on April 9, 1483, when King Edward IV died unexpectedly at Westminster Palace at the age of 40. England had only recently emerged from decades of civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses, a struggle between the House of York and the House of Lancaster for control of the English throne. Edward IV had secured the crown after years of warfare, but his death immediately created uncertainty. His heir was not an experienced ruler, but a 12-year-old boy, Edward, Prince of Wales. Under English law, the child instantly became King Edward V. At the time, Edward was staying at Ludlow Castle near the Welsh border, while political factions in London began positioning themselves for influence over the young monarch. Edward IV had appointed his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector of the realm until the boy reached adulthood. Richard was widely respected as a military commander and had spent years supporting his brother's reign. Yet another powerful faction existed around the king's widow, Elizabeth Woodville, and her extensive family network. The Woodvilles had gained enormous influence during Edward IV's reign, and many nobles distrusted them. The struggle for control of the new king began almost immediately. On April 30, 1483, Richard intercepted Edward V on his journey to London. At Stony's Stratford, he arrested several leading members of the Woodville faction, including Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers, who was the young king's uncle and one of the most powerful men in England. Richard accused them of plotting against him and seized custody of Edward V. Contemporary sources confirmed the arrests, although historians still debate whether a genuine conspiracy existed. Rivers and 2 allies were later executed at Pontefract Castle on June 25, without what modern observers would consider a proper trial. The young king continued to London under Richard's supervision. On May 19, Edward V entered the Tower of London. Today, the tower is remembered primarily as a prison, but in the 15th century it also served as a royal residence. Newly crowned monarchs often stayed there before their coronations. Nothing initially appeared unusual. Preparations continued for Edward's coronation, which was scheduled for June 22. Chroniclers reported seeing the boy regularly within the fortress. A few weeks later, Richard persuaded the Queen to release Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, from sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. The 9-year-old prince joined his brother in the Tower. This would become one of the most significant moments in the case, because it was the last time the 2 boys were known to be together publicly. Witnesses later recalled seeing them playing in the gardens and looking out from windows overlooking the city. Nobody realized they were observing what would become the prince's final confirmed appearances. The political situation then changed dramatically. On June 13, William Hastings, one of Edward IV's closest allies and a man who had supported Richard's position as protector, was suddenly arrested during a council meeting at the Tower of London. Richard accused him of treason. Hastings was executed the same day. The speed of the execution shocked contemporaries and signaled that Richard was moving aggressively to consolidate power. 9 days later, on June 22nd, a sermon delivered at St. Paul's Cross by Dr. Ralph Shaw introduced an explosive claim. According to the sermon, Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid because of a previous marriage contract. If true, all children born from the marriage were illegitimate. The argument provided a legal basis for excluding Edward V and his siblings from succession. Parliament later endorsed this position through a document known as Titulus Regius. On June 26, Richard accepted the crown and became King Richard III. The two boys who had recently stood first and second in line to rule England were suddenly removed from the succession. After Richard's coronation on July 6, reports concerning the princes became increasingly scarce. One of the most important contemporary witnesses was Dominic Mancini, an Italian cleric visiting England during the crisis. Writing in December 1483, Mancini reported that the boys were seen less frequently as the summer progressed. According to his account, they eventually disappeared from public view altogether. Mancini wrote that rumors spread throughout London, claiming the princes were dead. He also recorded reports that Edward V had become withdrawn and spent long periods in religious devotion. Significantly, Mancini did not claim to know their fate. He merely documented what people were saying at the time. This uncertainty is what transformed a political crisis into a mystery. No official statement announced the deaths of the princes. No bodies were presented, no funeral ceremonies took place, no burial records identified where they had been laid to rest. The historical record simply falls silent. For two children whose existence affected the legitimacy of the English crown, the absence of documentation is extraordinary. Suspicion quickly centered on Richard III. He possessed the clearest motive. As long as Edward V and his brother remained alive, they represented a threat to his authority. Any rebellion against Richard could rally around the legitimate sons of Edward IV. Many historians consider Richard the most likely suspect for precisely this reason. However, proving guilt is another matter. No contemporary document directly states that Richard ordered the princes' deaths. No eyewitness account survives. No confession was ever recorded. The most famous accusation emerged decades later. Around 1513, Sir Thomas More wrote a detailed account alleging that Richard III ordered the murder of the princes. According to More, the king instructed Sir James Tyrrell to arrange their deaths inside the tower. More described the boys being smothered in their bed and secretly buried. The story became enormously influential and later helped shape William Shakespeare's portrayal of Richard III as a ruthless villain. Yet historians have long questioned the reliability of More's account. He was born after the events occurred and relied on sources that cannot always be independently verified. His narrative may preserve genuine traditions, but it cannot be treated as direct evidence. The rise of the Tudor dynasty further complicates the case. Richard III was killed on August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field by forces loyal to Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. The new king had strong reasons to promote a negative image of Richard. Tudor legitimacy depended partly on portraying the previous king as a tyrant. Historians therefore debate whether some accusations against Richard were amplified for political purposes after his death. Alternative suspects have occasionally been proposed. Henry VII himself is one possibility. If the princes survived beyond 1485, they represented a major threat to his throne. Another candidate is Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, one of Richard's closest allies before rebelling later in 1483. Some researchers have suggested Buckingham may have acted independently. Others believe the princes may have died from illness or been killed by unknown individuals seeking political advantage. None of these theories has been supported by decisive evidence. The mystery gained a new chapter nearly 2 centuries later. In 1674, workers carrying out renovations inside the Tower of London discovered a wooden chest beneath a staircase in the White Tower. Inside were the skeletal remains of 2 children. King Charles II ordered the bones transferred to Westminster Abbey, where they were interred with royal honors. Many immediately concluded that the remains belonged to the missing princes. In 1933, the bones were examined by Lawrence Tanner, Professor William Wright, and Dr. George Northcroft. Their study suggested that the remains were consistent with children of approximately the correct ages. However, the examination could not establish identity. Modern forensic techniques such as advanced DNA analysis were unavailable at the time. Numerous scholars have since argued that the evidence remains inconclusive. Requests for new scientific testing have generated debate for decades, but comprehensive DNA analysis has never been approved. Tina Fontaine was only 15 years old when her body was discovered in the Red River in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on August 17, 2014. More than a decade later, her death remains one of Canada's most disturbing and controversial criminal mysteries. Unlike many murder cases, investigators recovered a body but could never determine exactly how the victim died. Police identified a prime suspect, charged him with second-degree murder, and brought him to trial. Yet in February 2018, a jury acquitted him. No one has ever been convicted for Tina Fontaine's death. What transformed the case into a national mystery was not only the tragic loss of a teenager, but the extraordinary number of unanswered questions surrounding her final days, the failures of institutions that encountered her before her disappearance, and the absence of definitive forensic evidence capable of proving what happened. Tina Michelle Fontaine was born on January 1, 1999, and belonged to the Saking First Nation in Manitoba. Her childhood was marked by instability and trauma. Her father, Eugene Fontaine, was murdered in 2011. Her mother struggled with addiction. According to court records and later public inquiries, Tina spent periods of her youth in the child welfare system. In the summer of 2014, she traveled from Saking First Nation to Winnipeg. What followed would become one of the most heavily scrutinized timelines in modern Canadian criminal history. The first major warning signs appeared in late July and early August 2014. Tina was reported missing multiple times. According to police records later discussed during court proceedings, authorities had several opportunities to encounter or identify her during the weeks before her death. On August 8, Winnipeg police stopped a vehicle in which Tina was a passenger. Officers learned she was a missing child. However, after discussions at the scene, she was not taken into protective custody. Years later, this encounter became one of the most criticized decisions associated with the case. Former Winnipeg Police Chief Devin Clunas publicly acknowledged that mistakes had been made and that officers should have done more to protect the teenager. The final confirmed days of Tina's life were reconstructed through surveillance footage, witness statements, phone records, and police investigations. Security cameras captured her in downtown Winnipeg on multiple occasions during August 2014. One of the most significant pieces of evidence emerged from surveillance footage recorded on August 8. The video showed Tina walking through a Winnipeg area known for crime, exploitation, and drug activity. Investigators later spent years attempting to identify everyone who interacted with her during this period. Yet despite extensive efforts, many of those interactions remain unclear. The individual who eventually became the focus of the investigation was Raymond Cormier, a Winnipeg man known to police. Investigators linked him to Tina through witness testimony, phone evidence, and recorded conversations obtained during an undercover operation. According to evidence presented during the later murder trial, Cormier was among the last known adults to have contact with Tina. Prosecutors argued that he played a central role in her disappearance and death. However, the evidence remained largely circumstantial. The discovery of Tina's body intensified the mystery. On August 17, 2014, a passerby spotted a bundle floating in Winnipeg's Red River near the Alexander docks. When authorities recovered the package, they found Tina's remains wrapped in a duvet cover and weighted down with rocks. The circumstances strongly suggested deliberate concealment. Investigators immediately suspected foul play. Yet the forensic findings produced an unexpected obstacle that would haunt the case for years. Dr. John Yunes, the forensic pathologist who examined Tina's remains, concluded that the cause of death could not be determined. The body had been submerged in water long enough that decomposition significantly limited forensic analysis. During subsequent legal proceedings, experts testified that there was no definitive evidence establishing whether Tina died from strangulation, drowning, overdose, blunt force trauma, or another cause. This finding created one of the most unusual aspects of the case. The physical evidence strongly indicated criminal activity, yet medical science could not establish precisely how death occurred. The inability to determine a cause of death became the foundation of the defense strategy when Raymond Cormier eventually faced trial. Prosecutors argued that the circumstances surrounding the body demonstrated homicide beyond reasonable doubt. They pointed to the wrapping of the body, the rocks used to weigh it down, and evidence suggesting Tina had been exploited shortly before her disappearance. The defense countered that suspicion alone could not substitute for proof. Without a known cause of death, they argued, prosecutors could not conclusively demonstrate that Cormier had murdered Tina. One of the most dramatic moments in the investigation came from a police undercover operation known as a Mr. Big-style investigation. Officers secretly recorded conversations involving Cormier. In one recording, he appeared to make troubling statements regarding Tina. Prosecutors believed these conversations supported their case. However, the recordings were often ambiguous and open to interpretation. Defense lawyers argued that the statements were unreliable and did not constitute a confession. The jury ultimately agreed that the evidence did not meet the legal threshold required for conviction. When the murder trial opened in Winnipeg in January 2018, public attention was intense. Canadian media outlets including CBC News, CTV News, Global News, and the Winnipeg Free Press provided extensive daily coverage. Many observers viewed the proceedings as a test of whether justice could be achieved despite major evidentiary gaps. Prosecutors presented witness testimony, surveillance evidence, forensic findings, and recordings involving Cormier. Yet the central problem remained unchanged. No witness saw Tina being killed. No forensic evidence directly connected Cormier to a murder. No medical expert could explain exactly how Tina died. On February 22, 2018, after deliberation, the jury found Raymond Cormier not guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict shocked many Canadians. Family members expressed devastation. Demonstrators gathered outside the courthouse. Prosecutors acknowledged the difficulty of the case but accepted the verdict. Legally, the case had reached its conclusion, yet for the public the mystery remained unresolved. What elevated Tina Fontaine's death from a tragic homicide investigation into a national symbol was the broader context surrounding Indigenous women and girls in Canada. Journalists, activists, and community leaders pointed to patterns of violence, exploitation, and institutional neglect. Tina's case became a major catalyst for discussions surrounding missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. According to reporting by CBC News and findings later examined by the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, many Canadians viewed the case as evidence of systemic failures affecting vulnerable Indigenous youth. Another layer of mystery involves the final 48 hours of Tina's life. Investigators established portions of her movements through surveillance cameras and witness accounts, yet significant gaps remain. Who exactly was with her during her final night alive? How many individuals interacted with her? Was she alone when she died? Did others help dispose of her body? Despite years of investigation, authorities have never publicly answered these questions. Even after extensive review of evidence, police could not reconstruct a complete timeline of her final hours. The case also generated intense scrutiny of child welfare agencies and law enforcement. Multiple official reviews examined missed opportunities to intervene. Critics noted that Tina had contact with social services, hospitals, shelters, and police during the days before her death. Each encounter represented a potential opportunity to protect her. Former Manitoba advocate for children and youth Darlene MacDonald and other officials later highlighted these failures in reports and public statements. The resulting criticism extended far beyond the criminal investigation itself. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the mystery is the contradiction at its center. Few people doubt that Tina Fontaine was the victim of a serious crime. The condition in which her body was found strongly suggests deliberate human action, yet the legal system requires proof, not assumptions. Because forensic science could not identify a cause of death, investigators could not present the definitive evidence necessary to eliminate reasonable doubt. The result is a rare criminal case in which the public largely agrees that a terrible crime occurred, while the courts could not determine who was legally responsible. Today, Tina Fontaine's death remains officially unsolved. Winnipeg police have stated that the investigation remains open and that new evidence could potentially revive the case. No additional charges have been laid. No alternative suspect has been publicly identified. The unanswered questions that existed in August 2014 continue to exist today. What happened during Tina Fontaine's final hours? How did she die? Who wrapped her body in a duvet and weighted it with rocks before placing it in the Red River? And perhaps most troubling of all, how did a 15-year-old girl encounter so many institutions capable of helping her, yet still disappear without anyone stopping the tragedy that followed? Those questions continue to define one of Canada's most haunting modern mysteries. In the spring of 1999, one of the most notorious criminal cases in Hong Kong began unfolding behind the walls of a small apartment in Causeway Bay. What started as the disappearance of a young woman soon developed into a case so disturbing that it dominated headlines across Asia and would remain etched into the public memory for decades. Even today, more than 25 years later, many people recognize the story not by the victim's name, but by the object that became forever associated with the crime, a Hello Kitty doll. The victim was Fan Man Yi, a 23-year-old woman living in Hong Kong. Her life had been marked by instability, financial hardship, and involvement in the city's criminal underworld. By early 1999, she had become entangled with several men connected to local triad circles. According to evidence later presented in court, a dispute involving money eventually led to a chain of events that would shock an entire city. Around March 1999, Fan Man Yi was taken to an apartment located on Granville Road in the busy district of Causeway Bay. The neighborhood was known for its crowded streets, shops, restaurants, and nightlife. To the people passing by outside, the building appeared ordinary. Few could have imagined what prosecutors would later describe as weeks of confinement occurring inside one of its rooms. Investigators would later conclude that Fan was held in the apartment against her will for approximately 1 month. During that period, she was repeatedly intimidated and subjected to severe mistreatment. The exact sequence of events remains difficult to reconstruct because much of the evidence came from witness testimony and statements provided after the fact. However, what emerged during the investigation painted a picture of sustained abuse carried out by several individuals over an extended period of time. The central figure in the case was Chan Nai-ming, a 34-year-old man with connections to organized crime. Alongside him were Ling Xingqiu and Ling Weilun. Prosecutors argued that the three men participated in the unlawful detention and mistreatment of Fan Man Yi inside the apartment. Throughout the trial, the defense and prosecution would present competing interpretations of what had happened, but neither side disputed that Fan had died during the period she was being held. For weeks, nobody outside the apartment reported seeing anything unusual. Hong Kong in 1999 was a city of nearly 7 million people, one of the busiest urban centers in the world. Thousands of residents passed through Causeway Bay every day. Amid the noise, traffic, and constant movement of city life, the disappearance of a single woman initially attracted little attention. Everything changed in May 1999. On May 24, a 13-year-old girl walked into a police station and told officers a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. The teenager had spent time with the suspects and claimed she had witnessed disturbing events inside the apartment. At first, investigators were skeptical. The allegations were extraordinary, yet the details she provided were specific enough to warrant further investigation. Police soon searched the apartment. What they discovered transformed the case into one of the most infamous criminal investigations in Hong Kong history. Inside the residence, officers recovered physical evidence that supported portions of the girl's account. Among the items found was a large Hello Kitty doll. According to investigators, evidence connected to the victim had been concealed inside the toy. News of the discovery spread rapidly through local media. Within days, newspapers across Hong Kong were referring to the investigation as the Hello Kitty murder case, a name that would ultimately overshadow almost every other aspect of the crime. The unusual association between a violent criminal investigation and one of the world's most recognizable cartoon characters captured international attention. Television stations, newspapers, and magazines throughout Asia reported on the story. As details emerged, public fascination grew. The contrast between the innocence represented by the Hello Kitty brand and the nature of the allegations created a level of media interest rarely seen in Hong Kong at the time. Following the discovery, police arrested Chan Nai-ming, Ling Xingqiu, and Ling Weilun. Investigators spent months gathering evidence and interviewing witnesses. Because important physical evidence was limited, the prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony, forensic analysis, and statements from people connected to the suspects. The trial began in 2000 at Hong Kong's High Court. Over the course of the proceedings, jurors heard testimony describing the conditions inside the apartment and the events leading up to Fan Man-yi's death. Prosecutors argued that the victim had been unlawfully detained and subjected to repeated abuse. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's narrative and questioned certain witness accounts. As often happens in complex criminal cases, not every detail could be conclusively established. One of the most significant issues involved determining the exact legal responsibility of the defendants for Fan's death. Although prosecutors presented evidence of prolonged mistreatment, establishing the precise cause of death proved difficult because of the condition of the available remains and the limitations of forensic evidence. This uncertainty became a central issue during deliberations. Ultimately, the jury did not convict the defendants of murder. Instead, on December 6, 2000, Chan Nai-ming, Leung-shing Cho, and Leung Wai-lun were found guilty of manslaughter. Under Hong Kong law, the conviction reflected the jury's conclusion that the defendants bore criminal responsibility for Fan Man-yi's death, even though the prosecution had not established every element necessary for a murder conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. The court imposed life imprisonment on all three men. The verdict closed the legal chapter of the case, but public discussion continued long afterward. Many people questioned how such events could have occurred in one of Asia's most modern cities without attracting attention sooner. Others focused on the social issues highlighted by the investigation, including organized crime, drug abuse, vulnerable women living on the margins of society, and the challenges faced by law enforcement when dealing with crimes that occur behind closed doors. Over time, the Hello Kitty murder case became more than a criminal investigation. It evolved into a cultural reference point in Hong Kong. Books, documentaries, television programs, and films revisited the story. New generations who had not been alive in 1999 learned about the case through media retellings. Yet despite the notoriety of the name, one detail is often forgotten. At the center of the story was not a headline, a courtroom battle, or a media sensation. It was a young woman named Fan Man-yi. While the Hello Kitty doll became the symbol remembered around the world, the victim's identity gradually faded into the background. The case remains one of the most widely discussed crimes in Hong Kong history, not because it was unsolved, but because it exposed how cruelty, intimidation, and exploitation could remain hidden in plain sight within one of the world's busiest cities. More than 2 decades later, the events of 1999 continue to serve as a reminder that some of the most shocking crimes do not occur in isolated places. Sometimes they happen in ordinary buildings, on ordinary streets, surrounded by thousands of people who never realize what is taking place just beyond a closed door. The story of the Hwaseong serial murders begins in the rural farming communities of Hwaseong, Gyeonggi Province, South Korea, an area located south of Seoul that in the mid-1980s consisted largely of rice fields, narrow country roads, irrigation canals, and small villages. What started as a single unexplained homicide in September 1986 would eventually become the most infamous criminal investigation in South Korean history, inspire one of the country's greatest films, and remain unsolved for more than 3 decades before advances in DNA technology finally revealed the identity of the killer. For years, the case became a symbol of fear, frustration, and the limitations of forensic science in an era before modern DNA analysis. The first known victim was 71-year-old Lee Wan-im. On September 15, 1986, she disappeared while returning home after visiting her daughter in the Hwasong area. 4 days later, on September 19th, her body was discovered in a pasture near Anyang-ri. Investigators determined that she had been murdered, but at the time there was little indication that the crime would become part of a much larger pattern. Just over a month later, on October 20th, 1986, 25-year-old Park Hyun-suk disappeared after getting off a bus while returning home from Songtan. Her body was found 3 days later in a canal near Jinan-ri. The similarities between the two crimes immediately attracted attention. Both victims had been attacked in isolated rural locations and left in areas where they were unlikely to be discovered quickly. A third victim followed on December 12, 1986. 25-year-old Kwon Jung-ban vanished near her home. Her remains would not be discovered until April 23, 1987, on an embankment in the Hwaseong area. As investigators compared the details of the three murders, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. The victims were women, often alone, attacked in rural areas during the evening or nighttime hours. In several cases, the victims had been restrained, sexually assaulted, and strangled. The method suggested a single offender who was growing increasingly confident. Over the next several years, the attacks continued. Women ranging from teenagers to elderly residents became targets. The murders occurred between September 15, 1986, and April 3, 1991. In most cases, the victims were found bound, gagged, sexually assaulted, and strangled with articles of their own clothing, such as stockings, socks, or underwear. The crimes created widespread panic throughout South Korea. Residents changed their daily routines, women avoided traveling alone at night, and parents became increasingly fearful for the safety of their daughters. Rumors spread across the country. Some people believed the killer specifically targeted women wearing red clothing. Others believed he selected victims on rainy nights. Whether true or not, the public fear became so intense that nearly every unsolved assault in the region was examined for possible links to the serial killer. The investigation quickly grew into the largest criminal manhunt South Korea had ever seen. Police officers were deployed across the countryside, conducting surveillance operations and roadblocks. Investigators interviewed thousands of residents and examined every possible lead. According to official records, more than 21,000 suspects were investigated. Tens of thousands of fingerprints were collected, and approximately 2 million man-days of investigative work were devoted to the case. At one point, officers were positioned throughout fields and roads at regular intervals in an attempt to catch the killer in the act. Despite these unprecedented efforts, the murders continued. Every time investigators believed they were getting closer, the offender disappeared without leaving enough evidence for a conviction. One of the most important moments in the investigation occurred after the seventh murder. A bus driver and a conductor reported seeing a young man boarding a bus near the crime scene shortly after the attack. Their descriptions were used to create a composite sketch that became one of the most recognizable images in South Korean criminal history. Survivors of sexual assaults in the area described a suspect who was relatively young, thin, and ordinary-looking. Nothing about the description stood out. The killer appeared to blend seamlessly into everyday society, making him even more difficult to identify. As pressure mounted, investigators focused on a young welder named Yoon Sung-yo. In July 1989, Yoon was arrested in connection with the murder of 14-year-old Park Sang-hee, a victim associated with what became known as the 8th Hwaseong murder case. Yoon eventually confessed and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Authorities announced that the case had been solved, but questions remained. Yoon later claimed that his confession had been obtained through coercion and physical abuse during interrogation. Despite his objections, he remained imprisoned for years, while many investigators and members of the public believed the mystery had finally been resolved. Yet the murders themselves told a different story. The methods used in the other cases did not fully match the circumstances surrounding the crime attributed to Yoon. Some detectives privately suspected that the true killer had never been identified. Those doubts only grew stronger when the murders remained a topic of discussion long after Yoon's conviction. As years passed, South Korea underwent dramatic social and technological changes, but the Hwaseong murders remained an open wound in the national memory. The case inspired books, documentaries, and most famously, the 2003 film Memories of Murder, directed by Bong Joon-ho. The film portrayed the frustration, uncertainty, and dead ends faced by investigators. At the time of the film's release, the real killer had still not been identified. Another obstacle emerged when the statute of limitations became a major issue. During the period when the murders occurred, South Korean law imposed time limits on murder prosecutions. Although the law would later change and eventually remove the statute of limitations for murder, those changes were not retroactive. By the time modern forensic methods became available, prosecutors faced the possibility that even if the killer were identified, criminal charges for the Hwaseong murders might no longer be possible. Nevertheless, investigators preserved evidence from the case because of its historical importance and the hope that future technology might provide answers. That breakthrough finally arrived in 2019. Advances in forensic science allowed investigators to re-examine biological evidence collected decades earlier. Using modern DNA analysis and restoration techniques, forensic experts extracted genetic material from evidence connected to several of the murders. The DNA profile was compared against a national database that included samples from incarcerated offenders. The result shocked the country. The DNA matched Lee Chun-jae, a man who had never been publicly identified as a serious suspect during the original investigation. At the time of the discovery, Lee was already serving a life sentence for the 1994 rape and murder of his sister-in-law. For decades, he had lived unnoticed, in the shadow of the country's greatest unsolved mystery. Police announced the breakthrough on September 18, 2019. Additional DNA testing connected Lee to multiple murders within the Hwaseong series. Initially, he denied involvement, but the evidence continued to mount. Then, on October 2, 2019, investigators revealed that Lee had confessed. His admissions went far beyond what authorities expected. He confessed not only to the 10 murders traditionally associated with the Hwaseong case, but also to additional murders and more than 30 rapes or attempted rapes committed during the same period. According to investigators, the confessions matched details that had never been publicly released, giving them strong confidence in their accuracy. The confession also exposed one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in South Korean legal history. Lee stated that he had committed the murder for which Yoon Sung-yeol had been convicted. Subsequent reviews of the evidence supported that conclusion. After spending roughly 20 years in prison, Yoon was eventually cleared. His exoneration reignited debate about interrogation practices used during the 1980s and highlighted the dangers of relying on confessions obtained under pressure. What had once appeared to be a solved case became evidence of how far investigators had been from the truth. In July 2020, after an extensive reinvestigation, police formally concluded that Lee Chun-jae was responsible for the Hwaseong murders and several additional crimes. Investigators stated that he had committed 14 murders and numerous sexual assaults. Yet because the statute of limitations had expired for the Hwaseong murders, Lee could not be prosecuted for those specific crimes. Instead, he remained imprisoned under the life sentence he was already serving for the 1994 murder of his sister-in-law. The outcome created a strange conclusion to one of the world's most famous cold cases. The killer had finally been identified beyond reasonable doubt, but he would never stand trial for the crimes that made him infamous. The city of Baiyin sits in the arid landscape of Gansu province in northwestern China, a region better known for mining and heavy industry than for violent crime. During the late 1980s and 1990s, however, Baiyin became the center of one of the most disturbing and long-running criminal investigations in modern Chinese history. For nearly 3 decades, police pursued an unknown serial killer who targeted women and girls, leaving behind a trail of fear, unanswered questions, and one of the country's most infamous cold cases. The mystery began on May 26, 1988, when 23-year-old Bai Jinping was found dead in her apartment in Baiyin. The circumstances immediately alarmed investigators. There were signs that the attacker had entered the residence, and evidence suggested that the victim had been specifically targeted. At first, police treated the crime as an isolated incident, but that assumption would soon prove disastrously wrong. Less than a year later, on February 9, 1989, another young woman, 26-year-old Shi Jifang, was killed under strikingly similar circumstances. Once again, the victim was attacked in her home. Detectives began to suspect that the 2 cases might be connected, but the evidence available at the time was limited. China, in the late 1980s, lacked many of the advanced forensic tools that investigators rely upon today. DNA profiling was still in its infancy worldwide, and criminal databases were far less sophisticated than those used in modern investigations. As a result, detectives were forced to rely on witness statements, physical evidence, and traditional investigative methods. The attacks continued. Throughout the 1990s, women and girls in Baiyin and neighboring areas became increasingly fearful. Parents warned their daughters not to walk alone. Residents avoided deserted streets after dark. Rumors spread rapidly throughout the community, as each new murder reinforced the belief that a dangerous predator was operating undetected. Investigators noticed recurring patterns. The victims were female, ranging in age from children to middle-aged adults. Many were attacked while alone. Several crimes occurred inside residential buildings, suggesting that the offender was confident, patient, and familiar with his surroundings. The killer appeared capable of approaching victims without immediately raising suspicion. As the years passed, additional murders were linked to the same offender. Cases occurred not only in Baiyin but also in nearby Lanzhou, the capital of Gansu province. Police eventually connected 11 murders committed between 1988 and 2002. The victims ranged in age from 8 years old to 52 years old. The long time span of the crimes created a unique challenge for investigators. Many witnesses moved away. Physical evidence deteriorated. Leads that once seemed promising reached dead ends. Yet despite the passage of time, detectives remained convinced that a single individual was responsible. By the mid-1990s, authorities publicly acknowledged that they were dealing with a serial killer. Police circulated sketches and warnings. The case became widely discussed throughout Gansu province. In an effort to generate new leads, investigators offered rewards for information leading to the suspect's identification. Despite these efforts, the killer remained elusive. Every major breakthrough seemed to dissolve under scrutiny. The investigation expanded repeatedly, consuming enormous resources while producing few concrete answers. One of the reasons the case became so notorious was the killer's apparent ability to disappear into ordinary life. There were no obvious suspects who consistently matched the evidence. No dramatic confessions emerged. No eyewitness could definitively identify the attacker. Each crime scene provided fragments of information, but never enough to reveal a complete picture. Investigators believed the offender was likely a local resident who understood the area well and who had successfully blended into the community for years. The final murder attributed to the serial killer occurred in 2002. After that, the attacks suddenly stopped. For investigators, this created an entirely new mystery. Had the killer died? Had he moved away? Was he imprisoned for another crime? Or had he simply chosen to stop? The absence of new murders did not bring closure. Instead, it transformed the investigation into a cold case. Files were archived, but detectives never completely abandoned hope that advances in forensic science might someday provide answers. During the following decade, criminal investigations around the world were transformed by developments in DNA technology. Genetic databases expanded dramatically. Biological samples that once yielded little information could now be analyzed with far greater precision. Chinese law enforcement agencies increasingly adopted these techniques, creating new opportunities to revisit unsolved cases. Among the investigations selected for renewed attention was the Baiyin serial murder case. In the mid-2010s, authorities launched a large-scale effort to compare DNA evidence collected from crime scenes against an expanding national database. Investigators focused not only on direct matches but also on potential familial relationships. This approach had already demonstrated success in other countries, where relatives of suspects sometimes appeared in genetic databases even when the offenders themselves did not. The strategy dramatically increased the number of possible leads. The breakthrough finally arrived in 2016. Investigators identified a genetic connection involving relatives of a man named Gao Chengyong. Born in 1964, Gao had spent much of his life in the region and appeared outwardly unremarkable. He operated a small business and lived what many neighbors described as a normal life. Yet as detectives examined the evidence more closely, they found that his background, location history, and genetic profile aligned with information collected during the investigation. Authorities obtained a DNA sample from Gao and compared it with biological evidence preserved from the crime scenes. The results reportedly confirmed what investigators had long hoped to discover. The genetic material matched. On August 26, 2016, police arrested Gao Chengyong in Baiyin. The announcement shocked local residents. For nearly 3 decades, the serial killer had existed more as a frightening legend than as a real person. Many people who learned of the arrest struggled to reconcile the image of a seemingly ordinary middle-aged businessman with the individual investigators believed had terrorized the region for years. News of the breakthrough spread rapidly across China and internationally. The case immediately became one of the most discussed criminal investigations in the country's recent history. Following his arrest, authorities conducted extensive interviews and reviewed evidence accumulated over decades. Investigators reconstructed timelines, re-examined witness testimony, and compared old case files against newly obtained information. The immense scale of the investigation reflected the extraordinary length of time involved. Detectives who had originally worked the case in the late 1980s had long since retired. Some had spent substantial portions of their careers pursuing answers that finally appeared within reach. In July 2018, the case entered a new phase when Gao Chengyong stood trial before the Intermediate People's Court in Baiyin. Prosecutors presented evidence linking him to multiple murders committed between 1988 and 2002. The proceedings attracted widespread attention because they represented the conclusion of one of China's most famous cold case investigations. Families of victims who had waited decades for answers finally witnessed the judicial process move forward. For many relatives, the trial was not only about determining guilt, but also about obtaining long-awaited acknowledgement of what had happened to their loved ones. Later in 2018, the court found Gao Chengyong guilty. He received a death sentence. Chinese media reported that the verdict covered numerous murders and related offenses connected to the long-running investigation. For authorities, the outcome marked the successful resolution of a case that had remained open for nearly 30 years. For the victims' families, however, the conclusion was inevitably more complicated. No verdict could reverse the losses suffered between 1988 and 2002. What the trial provided instead was a degree of certainty after decades of uncertainty. The Baiyin serial murders remain significant, not simply because of the number of victims or the duration of the investigation, but because they illustrate how advances in forensic science can fundamentally change the fate of a cold case. Evidence collected during the late 1980s survived long enough to be analyzed with technologies that investigators could scarcely have imagined when the first murder occurred. The case demonstrated the value of preserving evidence, maintaining investigative records, and revisiting unsolved crimes, even when years pass without progress. On the evening of March 18, 1984, a crime began in Nishinomiya, Hyogo Prefecture, Japan, that would grow into one of the most bizarre and enduring mysteries in modern criminal history. The target was Yoshihisa Ezaki, president of the major confectionery company Glico, a household name across Japan, and the manufacturer of products familiar to millions of consumers. At approximately 9 p.m., two masked men armed with a handgun forced their way into the Ezaki family residence. The intruders tied up Yoshihisa Ezaki's wife and daughter before abducting the 55-year-old executive and transporting him to a warehouse in Ibaraki City, Osaka Prefecture. The kidnapping immediately became national news. Police mobilized thousands of officers, roadblocks were established, and the country watched anxiously as one of Japan's most prominent businessmen disappeared without a trace. 3 days later, on March 21, 1984, the case took an unexpected turn. Ezaki managed to escape from his captors by slipping through a bathroom window at the warehouse where he had been held. He returned safely, but instead of ending the crisis, his escape marked the beginning of a much larger campaign. Soon after, Glico began receiving threatening letters demanding enormous sums of money. The letters were written in a mocking tone and appeared to come from an organized group calling itself Kaijin Nijuichi Menso, translated into English as the Monster with 21 Faces. The name was a reference to a famous villain from the works of Japanese mystery writer Edogawa Ranpo, specifically the criminal mastermind known as the Fiend with 20 Faces. The letters quickly revealed that this was no ordinary extortion attempt. Rather than communicating privately with their victims, the perpetrators sent many of their messages directly to newspapers and magazines. They seemed determined to turn the investigation into a public spectacle. In one letter, they openly ridiculed the police and challenged them to stop the crimes. Their language was sarcastic, theatrical, and unusually confident. As the letters continued, Japanese media outlets published excerpts, transforming the criminals into a nationwide obsession. On April 10, 1984, the situation escalated dramatically. Several vehicles belonging to Glico were set on fire. Investigators soon discovered that the crimes were coordinated and deliberate. Then, on April 16th, another threatening letter arrived claiming that products manufactured by Glico had been contaminated with potassium cyanide. Although authorities found no evidence that poisoned products had entered stores at that stage, the threat was taken seriously. Public confidence in the company suffered immediately. Glico eventually halted production at some facilities, leading to losses estimated in the tens of millions of dollars. Throughout the spring and summer of 1984, police attempted to arrange meetings with the extortionists. The criminals demanded money and instructed company representatives to deliver it to designated locations. Surveillance teams watched train stations, highways, and parking lots across the Kansai region. Yet each time officers believed they were close to identifying a suspect, the perpetrators somehow evaded capture. The group appeared to possess detailed knowledge of police procedures and often changed plans at the last moment. Investigators increasingly suspected that at least one member had experience with law enforcement or criminal intelligence operations. One of the most significant incidents occurred on June 26, 1984, when police attempted to monitor a ransom exchange near Kyoto. During the operation, officers observed a suspicious man, later described as having sharp, fox-like eyes. He appeared calm, confident, and aware of his surroundings. The suspect escaped before police could question him. This individual would become known nationwide as the Fox-Eyed Man. Composite sketches based on witness descriptions were distributed throughout Japan. Despite extensive publicity, his identity was never conclusively established. As 1984 continued, the monster with 21 faces shifted focus from Glico alone to a broader campaign targeting multiple corporations. In October 1984, the group threatened Morinaga, one of Japan's largest confectionery manufacturers. This phase of the case would become the most frightening chapter of the entire saga. Investigators discovered packages of Morinaga candy on store shelves bearing labels warning consumers that the products contained poison. Unlike anonymous threats made in private correspondence, these warnings were attached directly to the products. Laboratory testing confirmed the presence of potassium cyanide in some samples. The discovery triggered panic across Japan. Supermarkets removed products from shelves. Parents worried about the safety of food purchased for their children. Television broadcasts repeatedly warned consumers to check packaging carefully. Remarkably, despite the poisoned products reaching public stores, no deaths occurred. Many analysts later noted that the perpetrators appeared more interested in creating fear and demonstrating power than causing mass casualties. The warning labels attached to some contaminated products effectively prevented potential victims from consuming them. By late 1984 and early 1985, the group expanded its targets further. Threats were sent to House Foods, Marudai Food, and several other major companies. Each communication followed a familiar pattern. The criminals demanded money, issued public taunts, and challenged investigators. Their letters displayed detailed knowledge of current events and often referenced specific actions taken by police. The authors appeared to follow media coverage closely and seemed to enjoy humiliating authorities. Japanese law enforcement responded with one of the largest criminal investigations in the nation's history. More than 100,000 police officers participated at various stages. Thousands of leads were pursued. Surveillance operations were conducted across multiple prefectures. Yet despite the enormous commitment of resources, progress remained frustratingly limited. Investigators identified potential suspects, examined extremist organizations, explored connections to organized crime groups, and considered the possibility of corporate revenge schemes. None of these theories produced enough evidence to solve the case. The pressure on investigators became immense. Public confidence in the police suffered as the criminals repeatedly escaped capture. This pressure reached a tragic climax on August 7, 1985. Shigeyoshi Yamamoto, the superintendent of the Shiga Prefectural Police and one of the senior officers involved in the investigation, was found dead after setting himself on fire near his residence in Otsu, Shiga Prefecture. Before his death, Yamamoto reportedly left messages expressing regret over his inability to solve the case. His death shocked the nation and highlighted the extraordinary burden placed on law enforcement during the investigation. Only 5 days later, on August 12, 1985, the monster with 21 faces sent another letter. Instead of expressing sympathy, the authors mocked the situation. The tone reinforced the public perception that the perpetrators viewed the entire affair as a game. The cruelty of the message intensified public outrage and further elevated the case's notoriety. Yet as suddenly as the criminals had appeared, they eventually vanished. On August 12, 1985, the group sent what would become its final widely recognized letter. Addressed to the media, it announced an end to the campaign against food manufacturers. The message included a statement often translated as, "We forgive Morinaga. We have no more bad things to say. If anyone blackmails food companies, it is not us but someone pretending to be us." The letter concluded with a farewell. After that communication, the stream of threats stopped. Months passed, then years. No additional verified letters appeared. No suspect was arrested. No organization claimed responsibility. The monster with 21 faces simply disappeared. In the years that followed, investigators continued examining evidence. Witness statements were reanalyzed. Handwriting experts reviewed letters. Composite sketches were updated. Various theories emerged. Some suggested the perpetrators were linked to the Yakuza. Others believed the crimes were committed by disgruntled former employees with technical knowledge of food production and distribution. Another theory proposed that the operation involved several highly educated individuals, motivated not by money, but by the challenge of defeating authorities. Despite decades of speculation, none of these explanations has been proven. One reason the case remains so fascinating is the apparent contradiction at its center. The criminals possessed the capability to kill. Laboratory testing confirmed that poisoned products existed, yet they repeatedly acted in ways that reduced the likelihood of fatalities. Warning labels were attached to contaminated packages. Threats were often announced publicly. Some investigators interpreted this behavior as evidence that the perpetrators sought psychological domination rather than murder. Others argued that the warnings were merely a strategy to increase fear and media coverage. Another enduring mystery concerns the identity of the fox-eyed man. Witnesses encountered him during surveillance operations, ransom exchanges, and other key moments. Multiple descriptions were considered credible. Yet despite nationwide publicity and one of the largest investigations in Japanese history, no one was ever definitively identified as the suspect. The image of the fox-eyed man became a symbol of the entire case, representing a criminal who seemed to stand just beyond the reach of authorities. Legally, many of the offenses eventually reached the statute of limitations under Japanese law, as it existed at the time. By the early 2000s, prospects for prosecution had largely disappeared. Nevertheless, the mystery survived. Books, documentaries, newspaper retrospectives, and academic studies continued examining the case. Historians of modern Japan often cite the monster with 21 faces affair as a turning point in the relationship between the media, major corporations, and law enforcement. It exposed vulnerabilities in food distribution systems, demonstrated the power of public fear, and revealed how a small group of determined offenders could command national attention without ever being identified. More than 4 decades after Yoshihisa Ezaki escaped from captivity, on March 21, 1984, many of the central questions remain unanswered. Who created the monster with 21 faces? How many people were involved? What was their true motive? Were they seeking money, revenge, notoriety, or simply the thrill of outsmarting an entire nation? Despite one of the largest criminal investigations in Japanese history, the perpetrators were never caught. The fox-eyed man was never identified, and the organization vanished without explanation. The result is a case unlike almost any other. A nationwide campaign of extortion, psychological warfare, and public manipulation that unfolded in plain sight, generated thousands of pages of evidence, involved more than 100,000 police officers, and yet ended with the criminals disappearing into history, leaving behind one of Japan's greatest unsolved mysteries. On the morning of March 26, 1991, the city of Daegu in southeastern South Korea was enjoying a rare public holiday atmosphere. Schools were closed because local elections were being held across the country, giving children an unexpected day off. In the western part of the city, near Waryong Mountain, 5 boys left their homes planning what seemed like a simple adventure. They intended to spend the day searching for salamander eggs and frogs in the wooded hills surrounding their neighborhood. None of them knew that their names would eventually become part of one of South Korea's most enduring mysteries. The 5 boys were 13-year-old Kim Jong-sik, 11-year-old Park Chan-in, 10-year-old Cho Ho-yeon, 9-year-old Kim Young-kyu, and 9-year-old Woo Chul-won. All lived in the Dalseo district of Daegu and were familiar with the mountain trails near their homes. According to family members, the boys left during the late morning hours and headed toward Waryong Mountain, a forested area overlooking the city. At first, their absence did not cause immediate concern. Parents assumed the children were spending the day outdoors and would return before evening. As daylight faded and the boys failed to come home, concern quickly turned into panic. Families searched nearby streets, parks, and wooded areas. When no trace of the children could be found, local police were notified. What began as a missing person investigation soon escalated into one of the largest search operations in South Korean history. Authorities initially believed the boys might have become lost somewhere on the mountain. Search teams combed the slopes, valleys, and trails surrounding Waryong Mountain. Police officers, firefighters, soldiers, volunteers, and local residents joined the effort. Helicopters surveyed the area from above, while ground teams searched every location they believed 5 children could have reached. Reports from the time indicate that hundreds of thousands of people eventually participated in various stages of the search. The case quickly became national news, with newspapers and television stations providing regular updates. Despite the enormous effort, investigators found virtually nothing: no clothing, no belongings, and no confirmed eyewitness accounts explaining what had happened after the boys reached the mountain. As days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, frustration mounted. South Korea had experienced child disappearances before, but the simultaneous disappearance of 5 boys from the same neighborhood was almost unprecedented. The investigation soon expanded beyond the possibility of an accident. Detectives explored numerous theories. One possibility was that the boys had been abducted. Another was that they had encountered a dangerous individual in the mountains. Some investigators examined whether the children might have wandered farther than expected and succumbed to exposure. Yet every theory suffered from the same problem: there was almost no physical evidence. The mystery grew larger as the years passed. Parents refused to stop searching. Among the most visible figures in the case was Park Jian-so, the father of Park Chan-in. Like the other families, he spent years appealing to the public for information and urging authorities not to abandon the investigation. Posters bearing the faces of the missing boys appeared throughout South Korea. Television programs periodically revisited the case. The children became known nationwide as the Frog Boys, a nickname derived from the widespread belief that they had gone to the mountain searching for frogs or salamander eggs on the day they disappeared. Throughout the 1990s, the case remained unsolved. Investigators received countless tips, but none led to a breakthrough. Rumors flourished. Some claimed the boys had been kidnapped and taken overseas. Others suggested they had witnessed a crime and were silenced. There were even theories involving military activities, because Waryong Mountain was located near areas occasionally used for training exercises. Yet no theory could be proven. As the years passed, one question became increasingly difficult to answer. How could 5 children vanish so completely in an area that had been searched repeatedly? Waryong Mountain was not a remote wilderness hundreds of kilometers from civilization. It stood adjacent to one of South Korea's largest cities. The absence of evidence made the case more perplexing with every passing year. Then, after more than 11 years of uncertainty, a dramatic development occurred. On September 26, 2002, nearly 11.5 years after the disappearance, 2 men gathering acorns on Waryong Mountain discovered human remains. The location was on a mountainside approximately 2 kilometers from the area where the boys were believed to have last been seen. Authorities were immediately notified, and forensic teams were dispatched to the site. The remains were eventually identified as those of the 5 missing boys. For the families, the discovery ended one chapter of the mystery, but opened another. The children had not vanished forever. They had been on the mountain all along. Yet this realization created a troubling question that investigators struggled to answer. If the boys were located relatively close to the original search area, why had they not been found during the massive searches conducted in 1991 and the years that followed? The condition of the remains became the focus of intense scrutiny. Forensic specialists examined the bones in an attempt to determine how the boys had died. Some experts reported evidence suggesting that at least several of the skulls displayed signs of trauma. Certain investigators believed these injuries might have resulted from external force rather than natural causes. Others argued that the damage could have occurred after death due to environmental factors, animal activity, or the passage of time. The debate quickly became controversial. A number of experts suggested homicide could not be ruled out. Some even proposed that the boys may have encountered an individual who attacked them. Supporters of this theory pointed to the unusual circumstances of 5 children dying together and remaining undiscovered for more than a decade. However, other specialists disagreed, arguing that available evidence was insufficient to establish murder conclusively. Another theory centered on accidental death. According to this explanation, the boys may have become disoriented while exploring the mountain. Weather conditions in late March can change rapidly, particularly in elevated terrain. If the children had become lost and sought shelter, exposure and hypothermia might have contributed to their deaths. Critics of this theory noted that it failed to explain certain reported injuries and the difficulty search teams had locating the remains. A third theory involved the possibility of a hunting accident or stray gunfire. Some observers suggested the boys could have been accidentally shot, and that the responsible party concealed evidence out of fear. Yet investigators never uncovered proof sufficient to support this scenario. The discovery of the remains reignited public interest across South Korea. Television documentaries, newspaper investigations, and crime programs revisited the case. Experts reviewed old evidence, interviewed witnesses again, and re-examined investigative decisions made in 1991. Despite renewed attention, no definitive explanation emerged. The case became even more complicated because interpretations of the forensic evidence often differed. Some specialists believed the available evidence pointed toward foul play. Others maintained that the remains were too degraded for a reliable determination. Without a clear cause of death, investigators struggled to identify a suspect or establish a coherent sequence of events. For the families, the uncertainty proved especially painful. They had spent more than a decade hoping the boys might still be alive. The discovery of the remains eliminated that possibility, while providing no clear answers about what had happened on March 26, 1991. Parents continued to advocate for further investigation, believing the truth had not yet been uncovered. South Korea's legal system presented another challenge. At the time, the statute of limitations for murder meant that certain prosecutions could become impossible after enough time had passed. Public concern surrounding cases such as the Frog Boys investigation contributed to broader discussions about how long serious crimes should remain prosecutable. In later years, South Korea abolished the statute of limitations for murder, although the change could not retroactively solve the Frog Boys mystery. More than 3 decades after the disappearance, the case remains officially unresolved. Investigators know where the boys were found, but they do not know with certainty how they died, or who, if anyone, was responsible. The mystery persists because every major explanation contains unanswered questions. If the boys died accidentally, why were they not discovered during the extensive searches? If they were murdered, who committed the crime? And how did that person avoid detection for so many years? If another event occurred, what evidence has yet to be found? Today, the Frog Boys case occupies a unique place in South Korean criminal history. It is remembered not only because 5 children disappeared together, but because the case exposed the limits of even the largest search operations. Thousands of people looked for answers. Entire communities mobilized. National media followed every development. Yet the central mystery survived. The image of 5 boys leaving home on a spring morning in Daegu remains deeply embedded in South Korea's collective memory. They set out toward Waryeong Mountain during a school holiday, expecting an ordinary day outdoors. Instead, their disappearance became one of the country's most famous unsolved cases. More than 30 years later, the questions first asked on March 26, 1991, still remain unanswered. What happened to the Frog Boys on Waryong Mountain? And why has no one been able to provide a definitive explanation for their fate? On the afternoon of June 3, 1995, a woman checked into the Radisson SAS Plaza Hotel, now known as the Oslo Plaza, in the heart of Oslo, Norway. At first glance, nothing about her appeared unusual. She was described as well-dressed, polite, and confident. She registered under the name Jennifer Fairgate, sometimes recorded as Jennifer Fergate, and claimed to be from Belgium. Accompanying her on the registration form was the name of a man identified as Lois Fergate, though investigators would later discover that no evidence existed showing such a person ever stayed at the hotel. The address she provided in Belgium turned out to be false, and from that moment forward, nearly every detail connected to her identity would unravel into one of Europe's most enduring mysteries. The Oslo Plaza was one of Norway's most prestigious hotels during the mid-1990s, attracting diplomats, business travelers, and international visitors. Jennifer checked into room 28th floor. Hotel records indicated that she arrived on Saturday, June 3rd, and spent the following days largely inside the room. Staff members noticed little about her beyond her reserved behavior. She occasionally interacted with employees, ordered room service, and was seen moving through the hotel. Yet despite being surrounded by hundreds of guests and employees, no one truly knew who she was. As the days passed, several peculiar details emerged. Jennifer appeared to possess very little luggage. Witnesses reported seeing only a small amount of personal property. More importantly, she seemed unusually careful about her privacy. During her stay, she repeatedly kept the room secured and allowed only limited interaction with hotel personnel. Nothing at the time suggested a crime or a major investigation was about to begin. The mystery deepened dramatically on June 5, 1995. Throughout that afternoon, hotel employees became concerned because they had been unable to establish contact with the occupant of room 2805. Several attempts were made to reach the room. Eventually, security personnel entered. Inside, they discovered Jennifer Fairgate lying on the bed. She had suffered a fatal gunshot wound. Beside her was a Belgian-made Browning high-power 9mm pistol. The room was locked from the inside, and there was no immediate indication that another person had been present at the time of her death. At first glance, investigators considered the possibility of suicide. However, as police examined the scene more closely, inconsistencies began to emerge. One of the first questions concerned the weapon itself. Jennifer had provided no documentation identifying who she was, and there was no clear explanation for how she had obtained the pistol. The serial number had been removed, making tracing its origin significantly more difficult. Investigators eventually determined that the firearm had likely passed through multiple channels before reaching Norway, but no definitive chain of ownership could be established. The woman's appearance raised further questions. She was estimated to be approximately 24 to 34 years old. She appeared healthy, well-groomed, and financially comfortable. Yet when police searched the room, they found no passport, driver's license, wallet, credit cards, personal photographs, address book, or any other form of identification. Such an absence was highly unusual, especially for an international traveler staying at a luxury hotel. In essence, there was nothing in the room that could reliably reveal who she was. The clothing she wore created another layer of mystery. Investigators discovered that labels had been removed from many of her garments. In some cases, tags had been carefully cut away. This made it much more difficult to trace where the clothing had been purchased or manufactured. Similar actions have occasionally been associated with individuals seeking to conceal their identity, though there was never any conclusive evidence explaining why the labels had been removed in this case. As Norwegian police continued their investigation, they attempted to verify the information Jennifer had provided during check-in. The results were startling. The address listed on the registration card did not correspond to a real residence. The telephone numbers associated with her identity led nowhere. No records could be found confirming the existence of a woman named Jennifer Fairgate matching her description. Even the name itself appeared increasingly doubtful. What had begun as an apparent suicide investigation was transforming into a baffling unidentified person case. Witness interviews provided only limited assistance. Several hotel employees remembered Jennifer, but none possessed information capable of identifying her true background. Some guests recalled seeing her in the hotel corridors, while others believed they had seen a man accompanying her at certain points during her stay. Yet these observations were inconsistent and could not be verified. No confirmed companion was ever identified. Investigators then turned their attention to forensic evidence. Fingerprints were collected, photographs were distributed, and international law enforcement agencies were contacted. Despite these efforts, no match emerged. The woman's fingerprints did not correspond to any known criminal database available at the time. Her dental records also failed to produce an identification. Without a name, family members, employment records, or travel documents, authorities found themselves facing an extraordinary challenge. The case gradually attracted attention beyond Norway. Throughout Europe, journalists began referring to Jennifer Fairgate as one of the continent's most perplexing unidentified individuals. Comparisons were drawn to other famous mystery cases involving unknown identities and unexplained deaths. The combination of a luxury hotel, a false identity, a missing background, and an unresolved death captured public imagination. Several theories emerged over the years. One possibility was that Jennifer had deliberately erased her identity before taking her own life. Supporters of this theory pointed to the missing documents, removed clothing labels, and lack of personal possessions. According to this interpretation, she may have carefully planned her disappearance, ensuring that nobody could easily determine who she was after her death. Another theory suggested involvement in intelligence activities. During the 1990s, Europe was experiencing significant political changes following the end of the Cold War. Some observers speculated that Jennifer could have been connected to espionage or covert operations. The false identity, apparent international travel, and systematic removal of identifying information seemed consistent with elements often associated with intelligence work. However, investigators never uncovered evidence directly supporting this hypothesis, and no intelligence agency has ever been linked to the case. Others proposed that another individual may have been involved in the events leading to her death. Questions were raised regarding the crime scene, witness statements, and certain forensic details. Critics argued that some aspects of the investigation deserved closer examination. Yet despite decades of discussion, no evidence has conclusively demonstrated the presence of a second person at the moment of death. For many years, the case remained largely dormant, remembered primarily by researchers of unsolved mysteries. Then renewed interest emerged in the 21st century. Advances in forensic science and the growing popularity of online investigative communities brought fresh attention to Jennifer Fairgate. Independent researchers revisited witness accounts, analyzed police records, and examined photographs from the hotel. The internet allowed people from around the world to contribute theories and observations that might previously have remained isolated. One of the most significant developments occurred when the case was featured in the 2020 reboot of Unsolved Mysteries. The episode introduced Jennifer Fairgate's story to a global audience and generated renewed discussion about her identity. Viewers analyzed every available detail, from her clothing and jewelry to hotel records and ballistic evidence. Thousands of amateur investigators joined the effort, hoping to uncover clues overlooked during the original investigation. Despite this renewed attention, the central mystery remains unchanged. More than 3 decades after her death, nobody has definitively established who Jennifer Fairgate really was. No family members have come forward with verifiable evidence. No government records have provided a confirmed match. No missing person report has conclusively identified her. The woman who checked into room 2805 on June 3, 1995, and was found dead 2 days later, remains officially unidentified. Today, the Jennifer Fairgate case occupies a unique place among modern mysteries. Many cold cases focus on discovering a killer, identifying a suspect, or solving a specific crime. In contrast, this mystery begins with a more fundamental question: who was the victim? The absence of a confirmed identity transforms every aspect of the investigation. Without knowing where she came from, investigators cannot fully reconstruct her life, her relationships, her movements, or her reasons for being in Oslo. The events inside room 2805 lasted only a few days, yet they generated questions that have persisted for more than 30 years. A woman arrived in Norway carrying a name that may not have been her own. She checked into one of the country's most prominent hotels, left behind almost no trace of her past, and died under circumstances that continue to provoke debate. Her real name, nationality, family, and life story remain unknown. In an age defined by databases, passports, surveillance systems, and digital records, Jennifer Fairgate somehow slipped through every net. The result is one of the most compelling unidentified person mysteries in modern European history, a case that continues to challenge investigators and fascinate audiences around the world, long after the door to room 2805 was first opened on that June afternoon in 1995. On the evening of December 30th, 2000, in the quiet residential district of Kamisoshigaya in Setagaya Ward, Tokyo, one of the most baffling unsolved murder cases in modern Japanese history unfolded. More than 25 years later, despite an extraordinary amount of forensic evidence, the identity of the killer remains unknown. The case, commonly known as the Setagaya family murder, continues to fascinate investigators, criminologists, and true crime audiences around the world, because it seems to defy logic. The killer left behind DNA, fingerprints, clothing, personal belongings, and even traces of his activities after the crime, yet somehow vanished without a trace. The victims were members of the Miyazawa family. 44-year-old Mikio Miyazawa worked for a foreign-affiliated company in Tokyo. His wife, Yasuko Miyazawa, was 41 years old and worked as a private tutor. The couple lived with their two children, 8-year-old Nina and 6-year-old Rei, in a detached house located beside a former railway line that had been converted into a public park. The neighborhood was considered safe, and violent crime was rare in the area. December 30th, 2000, began like any ordinary day. The Miyazawas spent time at home, preparing for the New Year holiday, one of the most important celebrations in Japan. During the afternoon, members of the family visited Yasuko's mother, who lived next door. Nothing appeared unusual. At approximately 6:38 p.m., Mikio sent an email from the family computer, one of the last confirmed activities recorded inside the house. Later that evening, the family settled in for the night. Investigators believe the killer entered the property sometime before midnight. A crucial detail of the case involves the house's location next to the former railway corridor. According to the police reconstruction, the suspect likely climbed a tree adjacent to the property and entered through a second-floor bathroom window. This window had previously been left unlocked because of ongoing renovation work in the area. The theory suggests that the killer used this route to gain access without attracting attention. The first victim was likely Mikio Miyazawa. Evidence indicates a confrontation occurred on the second floor shortly before midnight. Investigators concluded that the killer attacked Mikio near the staircase. During the struggle, the blade of the murder weapon reportedly broke. Despite this setback, the attacker continued the assault using another knife found inside the home. The violence of the confrontation suggested a determined offender who was willing to improvise rather than flee. After killing Mikio, the intruder moved through the house and attacked the remaining family members. Yasuko, Nina, and Rei were all killed during the same incident. The exact sequence remains uncertain, but forensic analysis indicated that the murders occurred within a relatively short period. By the early hours of December 31st, the entire family was dead. The crime might have remained undiscovered for many more hours if not for Yasuko's mother. Around 10 a.m. on December 31st, she became concerned after being unable to contact her daughter. When she entered the house, she encountered a horrifying scene and immediately alerted authorities. Police arrived and secured the property, beginning what would become one of the largest murder investigations in Japanese history. As investigators processed the scene, they encountered something almost unprecedented. Instead of fleeing immediately after the murders, the killer appeared to have remained inside the house for several hours. Evidence suggested he moved freely through the residence after the crime. He used the family's computer, accessed internet websites, consumed food from the refrigerator, ate ice cream, drank tea, and used the bathroom. The suspect even left fecal matter in the toilet without flushing. creating an invaluable source of DNA evidence. This behavior shocked investigators. Most killers attempt to leave as quickly as possible after committing a crime. Remaining at the scene for hours dramatically increases the risk of capture. Yet the Setagaya killer seemed unusually calm, almost indifferent to the possibility of discovery. This strange conduct became one of the defining mysteries of the case. The amount of forensic evidence recovered was extraordinary. Police collected fingerprints, blood samples, DNA material, shoe prints, clothing fibers, and personal belongings believed to belong to the killer. The suspect had apparently injured himself during the struggle with Mikio, leaving his blood at multiple locations inside the house. This blood provided a complete DNA profile. Analysis of the DNA produced several intriguing findings. Investigators determined that the suspect was male. Genetic markers suggested ancestry that was not entirely Japanese. Reports released by Japanese authorities indicated a mixture of East Asian and Southern European or Mediterranean ancestry. This revelation generated significant public interest because it potentially narrowed the suspect pool, while also raising questions about whether the killer had connections outside Japan. Police also recovered clothing believed to have been abandoned by the suspect. Among the items were a jacket, a scarf, gloves, and a waist pouch. Examination of these objects provided further clues. The clothing appeared to be common commercial products available in several countries. Investigators traced some items to manufacturers in South Korea and other regions, but no definitive suspect emerged. One of the most important pieces of evidence was a pair of shoe prints left at the scene. Forensic experts identified the footwear as Schlesinger athletic shoes, approximately size 27.5 centimeters. Investigators estimated the suspect's height to be around 170 centimeters, though estimates varied slightly over the years. The shoes themselves were relatively uncommon in Japan at the time, creating another unusual clue that investigators hoped would eventually lead to an identity.